Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to give people a minute just to take their seats. Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace. My name is Nancy Lindborg. I'm the president here, and I understand that weather fears have thinned us out a little bit, so I want to give a special welcome to the hardy among us who have come out in advance of the winter predictions. It's great to have you here for a really exceptional program. And I want to start by just welcoming some of the people we have with us here today. First and foremost, Senator Mitchell, who is a wonderful, stalwart friend of peace around the world. We're delighted to have you here. You'll hear more from him in a moment. Mr. Michael Lonergan, did I say that? Who's the Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Ireland. Welcome. Dr. Adrian Johnston, Chair of the International Fund for Ireland. Mrs. Stella O'Leary, the U.S. Alternate Observer to the International Fund. Mr. Willie McCarter, who's the former Chair of the International Fund for Ireland. And Mr. Norman Houston, the head of the Northern Ireland Bureau here in Washington, D.C. And we're delighted to have so many illustrious peace builders here with us who are bringing much experience. I'd also like to offer a special welcome to a group of community leaders who are here from Northern Ireland and Ireland as part of the American Management and Business Internship Training Program. And hopefully everybody will survive what may be or may not be the snow tomorrow. I want to give a special thank you both to Michael and to Ambassador Anderson and the whole embassy staff for the partnership on this event, and we really look forward to hearing from everybody. For those who haven't been here before, the U.S. Institute of Peace was founded just a little over 30 years ago by the U.S. Congress as an independent national institute dedicated to the proposition that peace is very possible, it's very practical, and it is essential for our global security. And we pursue a mission and a vision of a world without violent conflict by working with partners in conflict-affected countries and working with them to identify very practical skills, knowledge, tools that enable them to manage conflict so it doesn't become violent and to resolve it when it does. And we operate on the premise that there will always be conflict. The question is how to make it transformative, how to keep it from becoming violent in a way that rips apart societies and families. And so it's very much squarely within our mission to partner with the Embassy of Ireland today to mark the 30th anniversary of the International Fund for Ireland and reflect a little bit on what are the lessons that we can pull from that experience for the larger peace-building field and in particular for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When Northern Ireland's combatants made peace after decades of conflict, they did so on a basis of a foundation of both grassroots reconciliation and economic development that was built over a decade by the International Fund for Ireland. And today, similar efforts are underway in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That seems as intractable now as the Northern Ireland violence once did. So we draw hope from the lessons as we look forward. And USIP has had a long focus and engagement with both of these conflicts. Actively engaged with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the very beginning of USIP's history, as we've worked to both inform policy, prevented deterioration of conditions on the ground, and look at how to create a supportive environment that can drive and sustain diplomatic progress. We've also had an engagement with Northern Ireland from the very beginning of the Institute, including senior fellows such as Stephen Ferry, who was the former Council Secretary of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland. We've had more than 37 grants to the conflict, and many of our staff works closely to this day with the Corrymeela community, which is one of Northern Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organizations. And in fact, we'll partner with them to co-host a workshop later this month with South Sudanese organizations. So today is a wonderful opportunity to have former government officials, peace-building practitioners, and scholars to do that look at what worked in advancing peace in Northern Ireland and what are the lessons that we might extract from that to apply to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so we've got a wonderful cross-section of people who have been engaged through your own practice and experiences on both sides of that equation. And nobody is more qualified to kick us off than our keynote speaker, a longtime friend of the Institute, and a very distinguished peacemaker, Senator George Mitchell. Senator Mitchell has been very involved and committed to realizing this shared bipartisan vision of a world free with violent conflict throughout his career. And we've worked with him when he joined with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich to co-chair the task force on the United Nations, which USIP convened in 2005. You are a permanent presence here in our building. There's a video profile that I invite you to view of Senator Mitchell as part of our Witnesses to Peace Building, just right out here. And you spoke here at USIP shortly after we moved into the building as part of our Dean Acheson lecture series. So, and just recently, we were honored to host Senator Mitchell for a launch of his new book on the Arab-Israeli conflict, A Path to Peace. So for those of you who know Senator Mitchell and have had a chance to hear him speak, we are in for a treat, and we thank you once again for coming to share your knowledge and experiences. Please join me in welcoming Senator Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy, for that very generous introduction. Thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here and for your warm reception. I speak often, several this week because it happens to coincide with St. Patrick's Day. So for me, the introduction is the highlight of the program. Everything else that follows is secondary. And it's always nice to hear pleasant things said about yourself, particularly in front of an audience of strangers. The risk, of course, is that if you hear that kind of stuff often enough, you may begin to believe it. So I like to begin with a story about introductions and an occasion on which I was brought back down to earth. I chaired 3 separate sets of negotiations in Northern Ireland over a period of 5 years. When I finished, I wrote a book about my experience, and when it was published, I went on a tour of the United States to promote sales of the book. I received many, many invitations. In the process, I learned that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to come to their group and speak. I couldn't go, of course, but I went to many. And as I traveled this country speaking to Irish American groups, they developed among them an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, often truly ridiculous introductions of me. The proper reaction, of course, would have been for me to show some humility, but I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. And I became overly impressed with myself listening to these marvelous introductions. In Chicago, a fellow got up and spoke for 35 minutes and read off a list of everything I'd done in my life, much of which I'd not previously been aware of, so I particularly enjoyed that one. And then when I got to the last stop, it was in Stamford, Connecticut, the Stamford, Connecticut Irish American Society. When I entered the building, I had a hard time squeezing my head in the front door. I was so impressed with myself. Then an elderly woman rushed up to me, shook my hand vigorously, spent several minutes heaping praise on me, And then she said, I don't live anywhere near here. I drove 3.5 hours across the whole state of Connecticut to come here to ask you, please, would you autograph my poster? She handed me a poster with a photograph on it and a pen. I said, I'll be very happy to autograph your poster, but before I do, I think I should tell you that I'm not Henry Kissinger. It was a photograph of Kissinger. She said, you're not? Well, who are you anyway, she said. And when I told her, she said, why, that's just terrible. She said, I drove 3.5 hours to meet a great man named Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. So I said, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do to ease your pain. After a few moments, she said, well, there is. And when I asked what it was, she leaned forward, I leaned forward. We were in a conspiratorial crouch, and she said in a loud whisper, nobody will ever know the difference. She said, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster? So I did. And ever since then, knowing that that poster is hanging on her living room wall in eastern Connecticut, I've enjoyed these kind comments, but learned not to take them too seriously now. The really best part of the story is that about a year ago, Henry and I appeared together on a program in Manhattan. It was in one of these private clubs in a high-rise building, and it was a moderator and two of us on a stage, and we were asked questions about Middle East and China and other places, and I thought it'd be a good time to tell the story, which I did. The crowd laughed, and Henry seemed to enjoy it. When we finished the program, we found ourselves in the elevator going down to the ground level, and Henry said to me, he said, I have to tell you, he said, I've heard you speak often, particularly when you were Senate Majority Leader, and we've appeared together often. He said, but I've never heard you speak better than you did tonight. And I said, really? Well, that's quite a compliment coming from you. I said, was it my answer on China, my discussion of the Middle East? No, 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 no. He said, it was that story you told about me at the beginning. He said, that's really great. You should tell it all over America. And I do, and I report back to him regularly, so now I include the United States interest too for peace on my list. Well, I was asked to talk about my experience in both Northern Ireland and the Middle East as part of this conference, which will deal with the possibility of lessons learned or possible lessons. You'll hear from a couple of excellent panels this afternoon of people who have had specific grassroots experience in both places. I'll be somewhat general, but I've had the opportunity to participate extensively in both places, in both societies, and in both conflicts. And so let me say at the outset that when I announced the Good Friday Agreement in the early evening of April 10th, 1998, almost exactly 19 years ago, I said that by itself, the agreement did not guarantee peace or political stability or reconciliation. It made them all possible. But I knew that there would be, and I predicted that there would be many difficult decisions along the way to be made by future leaders. Indeed, the agreement itself expressly does not resolve, did not resolve every issue. The agreement created some commissions to deal with issues that the parties couldn't deal with. The Good Friday Agreement was, as are all such human efforts, a compromise, the best that could be achieved politically at that time. So in the search for peace, it is important to adjust our vision upward to the high and noble goal of peace, but it is also important to adjust our vision downward to make certain that we don't fall prey to the notion that once a political agreement is reached to end a conflict, that there'll be no further work or effort required. Indeed, one can argue that the agreement to end the conflict represents the beginning of resolving other conflicts, the importance of the agreement being to limit those future discussions and negotiations to democratic and peaceful means as opposed to the use of violence. There can be no doubt that crucial to every effort to achieve peace and every agreement to accomplish peace is effort at the grassroots level by individuals, by private groups, by government-sponsored groups, to maintain a constant level of communication and to keep alive in both societies, particularly when the political process is or appears to be stalled, to keep alive the hope and the desire and the manifested intention of the people for peace. The International Fund for Ireland is one of many organizations that's done outstanding work in that regard over a long period of time to try to find those areas of immediate friction at the local level, those areas of pain, those areas in which bringing people together is important to reduce stereotypes and demonization of those who represent other, either in religion or national identity or in territorial claims. This is really peace building at the immediate community level. But I think while it is important to pursue those efforts, to support them, to encourage them, it is also important, again, to maintain the proper vision. By themselves, such efforts will be inadequate to achieve peace unless there is also a comparable effort, indeed, perhaps more intense and more difficult, at the levels of governments or those groups who are engaged in the end to conflict, in those whose assent and support is necessary to bring about peace and stability, prosperity, and reconciliation at the higher level. And in that regard, in a sense, I think the people of Northern Ireland were fortunate. It's easy, common, increasing in all democratic societies and perhaps in some others as well, to denigrate, ridicule, and demean those who hold public positions. And for sure, much of it is well-deserved in every society. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that there are many occasions in human history when men and women of vision, courage, and integrity came together at a crucial moment in their society's history and took steps to end conflict and bring about peace. And that surely was the case in Northern Ireland. A lot of people have thanked me for my efforts and thanked President Clinton and a lot of others. Make no mistake about it. The real heroes of the Northern Ireland peace process were the men and women of Northern Ireland, the ordinary citizens, especially the women who made clear their desire for peace, or more accurately, a desire to end the bitter, hostile conflict that had gone on for so long. And the political leaders, ordinary people just like you and I, who'd spent their entire lives in conflict, but who, at a critical juncture in their society, summoned the courage and the vision to take extremely difficult steps, steps which exposed them and their families to the prospect of violence, steps which exposed some of them to the ending swiftly of their political careers, and all of them which were extremely difficult given the circumstances which had led them to that point. And so I think it's important that while we acknowledge, recognize, and promote activity at the grassroots level in government-sponsored organizations, in private organizations, in NGOs, and even by individuals, no one of us should think that's enough to do the job. It's an essential component, but it's just a component. I want to discuss one area, one subject area in Northern Ireland that was of particular difficulty, high emotion, and resounds to this day. The Good Friday Agreement includes a mechanism by which a process was established to permit the possible early release of prisoners, many of whom were imprisoned for severe acts of violence, murder, assassination, bombing. I met and spoke with many of these, almost all men, all of whom like to think of themselves and define themselves as patriots for a cause. Many of them, because I am an American, compared themselves to George Washington's army at Valley Forge. People on both sides. But to the widows who'd lost husbands in these murders and assassinations, to the fathers who'd lost sons and some daughters, to the individual citizens, the prisoners were not patriots. They were criminals. They were murderers. They were assassins. And so we had an extraordinarily difficult and moral judgment to make in terms of the agreement. I became convinced that no agreement would be possible if it did not include at least a process by which some of the prisoners could achieve early release. On both sides, there were political parties in the talks who were affiliated with paramilitaries. There had been many previous negotiations in Northern Ireland, all of which had failed. And after the last, most immediate predecessor to the negotiations in which I was involved, the British and Irish governments conducted a review of those discussions in an effort to find out what went wrong and how to learn lessons for the future. And one of the conclusions that they reached was that a principal reason for failure of the prior negotiations is that they excluded the political parties that had paramilitaries affiliated with them. And they limited the negotiations to what are called in Northern Ireland the constitutional parties, that is, the parties that don't have paramilitaries affiliated with them. And they reached a conclusion, common sense really, that when you're trying to end a war, it's hard to do so if you won't talk to the people who are fighting the war. So indeed, the very first assignment that I was asked to work on in behalf of the British and Irish governments was to try to resolve the tension that had developed in trying to get into the talks, because the British government had a policy that said the talks cannot begin until all of the paramilitaries surrender their arms in a verifiable way. And along with my two colleagues, the former Prime Minister of Finland and the former Chief of the Canadian General Staff, we conducted an inquiry, and we were told overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, that the talks couldn't get off the ground that way, that there was no way that the paramilitary groups on either side would surrender their arms prior to the commencement of talks, that there might be a hope of doing so during or after the process, but there was no prospect. And we made that report to the British government, which displeased the then Prime Minister, but we included enough in the report that provided a way to get people into the talks, including the non-constitutional parties with paramilitaries, on their accepting principles of nonviolence, which came to bear my name because they were in our report. And that got the talks going and ended up successfully, but it was an early indicator of the commitment of some of the parties to the paramilitaries and the paramilitaries to their members. So in the agreement, we had this prisoner release mechanism. After the agreement was reached on April 10th, under the terms of the negotiations, it was not self-executing. So there had to be a referendum, and the agreement, in order to take effect, had to be approved by a majority vote in a free and open election separately in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So I returned home on Easter weekend thinking my work was done, but I soon was called by both governments and asked to return to travel throughout Northern Ireland and Ireland, speaking in behalf of approval of the agreement. And one of the assignments I was especially asked to do was to meet with the victims, the survivors, the widows, to discuss this provision in the agreement. And I did so. I don't think I persuaded a single one of them to vote for the agreement. But I did try to persuade them that there was a logical rationale for the inclusion of the provision in the agreement. And the substance of my argument, which was usually made in extremely difficult and highly emotional circumstances, is that there is no possibility in bringing these conflicts to an end to resolve satisfactorily every single grievance. That, by definition, not every single person can be satisfied. That effectively would preclude an agreement because many of the grievances are diametrically in conflict, as were the societies themselves. And so that while I could not ask any widow or mother to put aside her grief, I could ask her to understand that if this agreement goes forward, there'll be far fewer others in the future who had to bear a similar grief. And that really it was the only way forward. It's a morally unsatisfactory argument to make and to listen to, but it was an essential one at the time. And I bring it up now because one of the most important contributions that's been made to the whole process in Northern Ireland has been the tremendous work done by many groups, by many individuals in talking to and working with both the victims of those prisoners who achieved early release and the prisoners themselves. It's a continuing problem. It's a wound that will never heal satisfactorily from anybody's standpoint, but it's an essential component, I think, of ultimately achieving stability and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. And that will surely be the case if and when the time comes for an agreement in the Middle East. Because in fact, the amount of physical destruction, the numbers of deaths, the numbers of persons grieving are significantly larger. The numbers of people involved are larger. The populations are much greater, and they're subject to tremendous external influences which did not exist and do not, to this day, exist in the Middle East. Let me discuss briefly now the Middle East First, the similarities. The surface similarities to Northern Ireland are obvious. A dispute over religion, a dispute over national identity, a dispute over territory. In reality, the differences are greater. There, in the Middle East, it is, in fact, much more complicated. About a year ago, I spoke to a large group of Irish Americans in the Queens in New York City, and I said to them that I'm about to say something I never thought I would believe, let alone say. And it was that I spent 5 years in Northern Ireland, and I thought the Irish were really very difficult to deal with. But then I went to the Middle East, and I spent 6 months with the Arabs and the Israelis, and by then it became clear that the Irish were really easy to deal with. A bunch of patsies, is the way I put it, compared to the Middle East. It really is more complicated, it's more difficult, and as I said, it's far more subject to external influences. Ireland and the United Kingdom and their constituent parts are surrounded by the English Channel, the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. The Israelis and Palestinians are surrounded by what is now the most turbulent and volatile part of the world, where you have rapidly growing populations, where you have governments lacking the ability to meet even the basic needs of their people, where the deep divisions within Islam, some of which have existed since for 1,400 years, since the Sunni-Shia split occurred in the succession, in the conflict to succeed the Prophet Muhammad, where it's now reached a peak of intensity and difficulty. All of this impacts the Palestinian and Israeli issue, and it in turn impacts those wider issues, intersecting, overlapping, sometimes contradictory conflicts, which make it so hard to even understand what is going, let alone to prescribe solutions, as we, the United States, and our allies have seen for a long time. But there are some things in common and some very important factors that have to be kept in mind. I recall very clearly my first day in Northern Ireland. I was taken to what is called the Peace Line. Many of you are from Northern Ireland, many here have been there, so you'll know that there is a wall which goes through the capital and largest city of Belfast, which divides the two communities. 30 feet high in places, topped with barbed wire in places, wire mesh caging in places. It goes right across major streets, sometimes right through buildings. It was intended, of course, to separate the two communities, to prevent violence, but it has become a continuing symbol of that violence. And interestingly enough, the desire to remove the wall declines the closer you get to the wall. So the people who actually live there don't want the wall taken down because they have suffered greatly, and they will be the last to accept or believe that they can lead normal lives. In the morning, I spoke on their side of the wall with the nationalists, predominantly Catholic. In the afternoon, with the Unionists, predominantly Protestant. I was amazed to find that there was so much interest. It was my very first day in Northern Ireland that the proceedings were broadcast live on the radio. And in it, a succession of speakers, community leaders, political leaders, ordinary citizens came in and talked to us. And what was most striking to me and my colleagues was how similar their presentations were. It was as though they had coordinated their discussions because they made essentially the same points, just the reverse in terms of blame. But the most lasting impression I had was of a young, extremely eloquent Protestant minister. Some of you will know Jackie Redpath, who's still very active promoting economic growth for people in the poorer areas of Unionist Northern Ireland. And he brought two maps. One of them, and he tacked them up on the wall. One of them, the title was Unemployment in the Urban Areas of Northern Ireland. And then he tacked another one on top of it entitled Violence in the Urban Areas of Northern Ireland. And you won't be surprised that they fit like a hand in a glove. All of these conflicts are largely identified in religious and national identity terms, but all of them have a deep and underlying economic context. Jackie spoke about the high levels of unemployment among poor Protestants and poor Catholics. He spoke about the lack of self-esteem that men have when they've never had a job, they don't have a prospect of getting a job, and the opportunity to get a gun and to have complete control over one or two blocks of an urban area gave them, in a perverse way, a self-esteem that none of us could really understand until we found ourselves in his or her shoes. And I think it's important to keep that in mind always in terms of conflict resolution. A peace agreement that is not built upon a foundation of economic stability and opportunity for all is a peace agreement that cannot endure. And that's why it's so critically important that the private organizations and the government organizations concentrate their efforts on the acquisition of skills, the acquisition of knowledge, the traditional responsibility of governments to enable people to gain the knowledge and skill to achieve success in life, to provide them the opportunity for success in life so that they can become productive, participating citizens in a positive economy and lead what people everywhere want. I've traveled to most of the countries in the world, a very large number. I've been in every Arab country and in almost all Muslim countries. In our country today, we have developing an attitude of a conflict between Islam and the West, which, in my judgment, is dangerous for all concerned, because I believe that the vast majority of Muslims want what people everywhere want. People in the United States and Ireland or every place else. A stable and a secure society, a decent job, a decent home, and most of all, everywhere, a chance to get their children off to a good start in life. And we have to recognize that if we are to achieve stability in societies that are now divided and have been divided by conflict. I want to repeat something I said earlier, and this is critical in the Middle East. You have to have, at the ground level, at the local level, the kind of individual effort that organizations are making now, still in Ireland and in the Middle East. The attempt to bring people together, the attempt to assuage grief, the attempt to recognize and to break down stereotypes and demonization. But that will not by itself succeed in the Middle East or anywhere else if there is not strong political leadership at the highest levels who are willing and able to engage. Peace building must come from below and above. One without the other cannot succeed. And so that's a critical factor right now in the Middle East. I want to leave enough time for the panelists to say something, so I'll bring this to conclusion on a different note. Of course, this week is St. Patrick's Day, so it's a day of celebration for the Irish. And my mother was an immigrant from Lebanon, and my father was Irish. So I have a relationship to both these conflicts in one way. But this being St. Patrick's Day week, I just want to close with a few words about my Irish heritage and my father. And my father's parents were born in Ireland and became part of what has been until recently one of the greatest human migrations in all of human history, as millions of people left Ireland in the 19th century, most of them for the New World, seeking freedom and opportunity. Many of them succeeded, and many books have been written about the successes, but the fact is that very large numbers of them failed and have been lost in the mists of history. My father never knew his parents. Mother died, and his father couldn't care for the children. So my father was raised in an orphanage where he spent several years before he was adopted by an elderly, childless couple who were not Irish, from a small town in Maine. There he met my mother, who was an immigrant from Lebanon. She could not read or write, and they lived a very hard and very poor life. But in their minds, they were successful because, thanks to the openness of American society, all of their children received the education they could not get, and each of us has lived a life that my parents could not even have imagined. My father was a quiet man. He said little, and he never, ever spoke about his upbringing. We learned much of his history after his death from some people who had helped him during his lifetime. So when you don't speak often, people listen when you do talk. And so I recall, and I'll close with this, when I was about to leave home to go to college, I'd never been away from home. My parents didn't own a car. We literally never went anywhere. My father sat me down at the kitchen table for breakfast. He was dressed in his work clothes. He was a janitor at a local school. My mother worked a night shift in textile mills. She had just come home from the night shift at 7 o'clock in the morning. Back then, the textile mills were booming in New England, and there weren't much in the way of health or safety regulations. So every morning when she came home, she was covered with lint because there was no lint reduction mechanism in these mills, and also covered with the grease that they used to lubricate the machines. So my father said to me, he said, "You're a smart young boy. I know you're going to do well. Wherever you go, whatever you do, I want to say one thing to you. Don't ever forget where you came from." And I never have. And it would be a good thing for every Irish American today, St. Patrick's Day week, to remember where we came from. 100 years ago, it was the Irish who were reviled, demeaned, denied opportunity. The signs all over America read, "Irish need not apply." The cartoons depicted Irish as subhuman, human faces imposed on the body of an ape or a chimpanzee. Every group that's come to this country has faced discrimination. African Americans, the only group brought here involuntarily, of course, most of all. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Italians, the Catholics, the Jews. No one in America has had longer or more discrimination than the Jews. And yet, every one of them, they got their hands on the bottom rung of the ladder of success in America, and they climbed up. And on their shoulders, the next generation climbed up even further. And every single group, without exception, have made tremendous contributions to our society to enable us to be a better, stronger, more diverse country. So it's a good time, given all the discussion in our country on the celebration of St. Patrick, for every Irish American to remember where we came from. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a great day.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Lonergan. I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Irish Embassy. I'm here very much as John the Baptist in place of a greater person, because normally it should be our Ambassador, Brad Anderson, who should be here, but she's with the Taoiseach in Boston on St. Patrick's Day related activities, unfortunately, and they're just staying, I understand, about 1 inch ahead of the storm as they make their way down here to Washington, DC for the festivities later on this month. But in her absence, I've been asked to come and say a few words and then to chair this next panel, which is a great honour and pleasure. First of all, I want to say what an extraordinary privilege it is to share a platform and to speak after such a distinguished American as George Mitchell. That was an incredible speech, particularly I think the last part, which was so thought-provoking and reflective and indicative of Senator Mitchell. Many wonderful Irish Americans and Americans have made a huge contribution to Ireland, to the cause of peace on the island of Ireland, but I think nobody ranks higher in the pantheon than that of George Mitchell, and it's great to see him here today. First of all, I should start by saying a very happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. St. Patrick's Day is not until Friday, but here in Washington it lasts a week. When I lived in Boston, it lasted a month. For those of you wearing green, thank you very much. For those of you not wearing green, this is the colour, so get your acts together for the rest of the week. I was lucky enough to be in the parade here in Washington, D.C. yesterday, which was a little cold but glorious, but much preferable to some of the parades I attended when I was living up in New England near Senator Mitchell's part of the world. I recall once parading in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I stood under showers in Ireland with lower water pressure than that which was falling from the skies. And at one point, the green in my tie started to run, and I realised that this really wasn't the weather for marching. But that sense of parading and pride in Irish American in the heritage, which is so strong across all this country, and it's such a privilege for all of us who get the chance to serve here at the embassy or at the consulates, and to take part in the extraordinary festivities that mark St. Patrick's Day here in the US. This is a great occasion, I think, to come together, though, as well this week on a topic of great seriousness, and one that I think that there will be great profit from some of the shared experiences that we have. We have two very, very interesting panels, I think, and I think this will be a great opportunity to generate some very good ideas. I want to thank, first of all, the US Institute of Peace, our partners in this event. Particularly, I want to thank the President, Nancy Lindbergh, and I also want to thank Lucy Kurtzer-Elbergen, the Director of USIP's Arab-Israeli Conflict Programme, and all of our colleagues who have worked with us closely to make this event possible. In particular, I want to thank Serena Razul. I don't want to say too much, because really the opportunity here is for the panel to give their brief presentations, and what we really want to have then, I think, is an opportunity for a lot of questions from the audience, and so that we have a lot of opportunity to have a real discussion going. I would say that, as many of you are aware, Irish people are often very good at asking questions and giving long answers, and so I'm going to suggest that in the interest of getting through a lot of questions, I'd ask when people would stand to ask questions that they would first of all identify themselves and by all means make an observation or remark, but try to get to the question, and we will try and get through as many people as possible. There's a famous story told that when Governor Alfred Smith, the first Irish Catholic to run for President of the United States, was once asked by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he said, "Al, why do you Irish always answer a question with a question?" To which Governor Smith said, "Do we now? Who told you that?" Which is answering a question with two questions, which is particularly impressive. But in any case, my point is that we will try, there will always be more questions and answers, but we will try certainly here in having some good questions and answer session. I was very struck too by the remarks that Senator Mitchell made about the parallels between the Northern Ireland peace process and the situation in the Middle East. And as he stressed, and we would all agree, every situation, every conflict is unique and requires its own particular local solutions. However, as one of our ambassadors in Tel Aviv used to like to say, that all these conflict situations are different, but equally he used to say all car crashes are different, but the outcomes are very much the same. And so therefore I think there's a lot of shared experiences and shared outcomes in both that I think we will be able to explore more deeply. Before I invite the panel to come onto the stage, and I'll introduce them briefly as they do, I just want to remember briefly here in this setting a colleague of ours who was very involved in the Good Friday Agreement, who was ambassador here in the United States when Senator Mitchell was appointed special envoy, and who headed the Irish government talks team in Belfast, and who would be a friend to a number of people here in the audience, Dermot Gallagher, who passed away earlier this year. I know he had many friends here in Washington, D.C., and indeed President Clinton kindly sent a message of condolence to his funeral. And here today in the city where he served such distinction as ambassador and played such a key role in much of the Good Friday Agreement, I just want to recall his memory here for those many in the audience who knew him well. Perhaps then on that note, I might ask the panel to take their seats on the stage, and I'll introduce them briefly as they do. Our first panel is the chairman of the International Fund for Ireland, Dr. Adrian Johnson, and Adrian will reflect on the fund's contribution since its establishment more than 30 years ago. Carol Cunningham of the Unheard Voices programme in Derry will speak about how it provides a platform for women affected by the conflict in Northern Ireland. Professor Brandon Hammer of the University of Ulster will reflect on the role of civil society in fostering reconciliation. And finally, Melanie Greenberg of USIP will seek to relate to the Northern Ireland experience to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, focusing on the bottom-up approach and the role of civil society. Each of our speakers will speak for approximately 5 to 7 minutes. And I think what we'll do is we'll take the 4 speakers in a row, and then we will move to the questions and answer session. So on that note, then I might ask Adrian Johnson to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour for me to stand here this afternoon or this morning on behalf of the International Fund for Ireland. And as has been said already today, the fund has now reached 30 years of peace building. And while we recognise that conflicts are different around the world, it has been something of great importance to the fund over the last number of years to ensure that the lessons that we have learnt in Northern Ireland can be disseminated as widely as possible to other areas emerging from conflict around the world. Just make sure I can use this correctly. Sorry, apologies. So the fund is a unique organisation in itself, and it was born out of the desire of the international community, and most notably the international community who had a large Irish diaspora, to look at how they could help pragmatically within Northern Ireland and resolve the conflict. And ultimately, the fund was co-created by the British and Irish governments around 1985 as part of the Anglo-Irish agreement discussions. And they had agreed that economic investment was the foundation that was required to end years of stagnation and decay within communities in Northern Ireland to bring about the conditions for ultimately peace. And at the time of its inception, as we now know, there were no blueprints for the IFI and no blueprints of the chart that we would need to take and operate in other ways that others simply hadn't done. And we drew upon our international support to enable that to happen. There were challenges and opposition, and people will talk about that, and I'm sure throughout the session today we'll discuss some of the challenges. But the fund itself, very much in its early days, did face challenges in terms of scepticism of the role of the IFI, and indeed within the international dimension of the fund. But what was of great importance at that time was the independence of the organisation. Independence was key during that period to ensure that we could get an impartial sense across both communities in Northern Ireland. And since 1986, the independence of the organisation has been greatly protected. Our objectives of the fund, it struck me when President Lindenberg was talking there that the missions of USIP are quite similar to the missions that were set out for the IFI. But the core role of the fund was basically to assist the British and Irish governments to secure a lasting peace on the island of Ireland. And from the outset, we had three main objectives that all of our work would fall under. Primarily, creating economic opportunities. Secondly, to focus on disadvantage and need. And finally, then, to promote contact, dialogue and reconciliation across the island of Ireland. And early in the fund's activity, the board had identified that the focus of our activity should be on areas that were formally designated as disadvantaged. And this was obviously as a result that disadvantaged areas, whether they be unionist or nationalist, suffered the most and the worst impact of the violence that had ravished through the region. And they hadn't enjoyed a proportionate element of the peace dividend. You'll see some figures there, and I'll let you read through them yourselves, but characteristics of the areas that we worked in included intergenerational unemployment, low educational achievement amongst our young people, low levels of skills and qualifications, as Senator Mitchell quite rightly pointed out, and also poor health. And due to these characteristics, it was a breeding ground, and there was often a history of paramilitarism within those areas. Conflict is born out of inequality, and positively transforming the economic and social profile of these communities was deemed to be high priority for the board and for the governments in securing a peaceful and healthy society. And by 1995, less than 10 years after the fund was founded, more than 70% of the fund's disbursements during that time were invested in areas that were designated as disadvantaged. You'll hear from Carol and one of our project leaders this morning, but there was a strong focus also on developing neutral enterprise space and economic activity, which would then lay the foundations for reconciliation work further in the future. And throughout all of this work, the fund sought to foster cross-community and cross-border relationships, exposing individuals and communities to new opportunities to learn, to work together, to create prosperous communities, and assisting communities to chart their solutions out of conflict. This approach was instrumental to helping the establishment of the conditions that would lead to the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, as Senator Mitchell said in 1998. And as you'll see from the programme timeline here, around the time of the Good Friday Agreement, the emphasis of the fund shifted directly away from economic activity and more towards activity that centred around dialogue and reconciliation. And the change in emphasis that we did there was also mirrored by external progress by society, moving from economic difficulties and conflict through to fragile political agreement and towards stronger economic conditions and more reduced violence. This was a sign of the fund's flexibility to move from influencing community dynamics and addressing emerging needs. And you'll also see, most notably, hopefully you can, at the end of the timeline, the fund has now moved into another phase, looking at the harder issues that still exist within our society. By that we mean the legacy of the past, paramilitarism and peace walls. I did touch about earlier on the independence of the IFI, and our funding from the United States of America, EU, Australia, New Zealand and Canada was received with relatively few restrictions. And as a result of that, we worked with flexibility outside of government interventions and outside of political parties. And we've been able to leverage significant support and funding through partnering with other organisations and statutory bodies. And that gives us a unique standing amongst community groups and a latitude to leverage other things that others simply can't do. The independent international dimension of the fund is a core attribute, and it's why the fund works and why the work that the fund does is sustainable. It has greatly helped to transcend political and community divisions, disputes and tensions, and allowed us to make the first significant interventions in areas where others just simply could not go. And that's exceptionally important today, as it was in 1986, given the fact that we're going through a period of political instability in Northern Ireland. We've maintained and sustained our long-standing support amongst communities by rapidly adopting our responses to their emerging needs, the challenges, and taking risks in partnership with communities. And that is exactly what the DNA of the fund is, risk-taking. The fund, unlike others, has been able to go into areas that were opposed to the political settlements, talk to those people and develop a range of interventions that would allow them to act positively and constructively within their society. Much of our work takes place in areas where others were unable or unwilling to go. Yet our success has continued to open new pathways for those communities to reconnect with statutory provision. These projects have been critical in addressing the elements that have potential to undermine the peace process and stability, and successful in resolving some of the most divisive issues that still remain within our society. Obviously, and this was touched upon earlier, one of the most obvious similarities between Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine is the bricks and mortar that separate our communities, and ironically referred to as peace walls in Northern Ireland. And these were first constructed in 1969 as a security measure, as a military response due to security concerns over sectarian violence and disorder. You'll see some graphics here. There were more than 100 remain across Belfast, and they span 21 kilometres throughout the city. In fact, many of these have lasted longer than the Berlin Wall had stood. I talked about the foundation, that work that we had done previously in the years, and the foundation activity and capital bills and providing facilities had been conducted in the early years of the fund, but had laid the foundation for projects like this to happen, and launched in 2012. Our Peace Walls programme supports communities to bring about the conditions where they feel that the peace wall can be removed. It provides a range of confidence and relationship building initiatives within and between interface communities, and assist residents to come to the point where they feel that it is safe and appropriate to remove peace walls from their area. But the impact of the peace walls are stark. We designed, due to the fund's extensive grassroots reach and activity, we can quickly identify when opportunities exist to address and drive communities forward through to some of these solutions, even challenging statutory bodies and government departments to address their responsibilities. We designed the programme for communities that expressed a willingness and an appetite and a readiness to explore the possibility of ultimately removing a peace wall. It helps them take the first step on the journey that is unique, and coordinates between ourselves, other funders, statutory agencies and the communities, and indeed political investment, so essential wider infrastructure and community regeneration can happen when the barrier is removed. And it's important to remember that peace walls are not the symptom of division, they're rather the cause of it. The majority of peace walls divide societies that were worst affected by the division in Northern Ireland. And you can see hopefully you can see from some of the statistics that are there, the vast majority of conflict-related deaths occurred in the vicinity of a peace wall. High level of social deprivation also existed. And due to this, we have communities with higher levels of mental health issues and underachievement within their youth. As I said earlier, they were erected as a security measure. And by looking at these statistics, one can only question if the peace walls actually achieved their objective. You'll see a statement from 1971 here. And briefly what it says is that peace walls should have no place in a normal society. But as we now know in Northern Ireland, they have become the norm in society. But there are real concerns that the early removal will negatively affect residents and communities. Safety, confidence and cohesion are vital to unlock the physical barriers in interface areas, and communities need support, particularly funding, but also, as Senator Mitchell quite rightly said, political leadership. The fund efforts are enabling us for communities to consider removing physical barriers. But that has been important progress, but not just the only progress that we have made. Other highlights that we have achieved over the past 30 years, we have changed education policy within the Northern Ireland Executive, so children from different backgrounds can learn together in shared classrooms. We have communities that have used our support to resolve complex and long-standing issues like parading and legacy of the past. And we're using our unique standing to improve the lives of so many young people and prevent a new generation from getting round again and drawing into violence, polarisation and paramilitary organisations. You'll hear shortly from Carol, and projects like Carol's Unheard Voices are giving marginalised women the opportunity, who have suffered greatly in the conflict, the opportunity to be heard and be constructive in the peace-building exercise. As hard as it is to secure the end to violence, and again, quite rightly, as Senator Mitchell said, it's harder to implement these agreements within communities, ensure that people don't turn away or become complacent about the peace that exists. And the job of peace building just doesn't end with a treaty. The international backing of the United States of America and others has given us the freedom from political and community interference and the flexibility to do our work more quickly to emerging need and to take important risks for peace. Our independence of the International Fund for Ireland is as relevant today as it was in 1986. It's very difficult to condense all of the work that we've done down into 30 minutes, and I tried to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of the work that we've done. You'll hear from Carol here just an example of some of the work that we've done, but I would just like to emphasise that this is an exceptionally important exercise for the IFI in sharing the learning of 30 years. Our door is always open. I hope to talk to as many of you as possible here today to ensure that we can reach out and share the lessons learned from the fund. I look forward to answering some more of your questions here later this morning. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the session.
Hope I get this to work as well. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Carol Cunningham, Project Coordinator of the Unheard Voices programme, a programme run by Craig Enterprises in Derry in Northern Ireland. I'd like to thank the United States Institute of Peace and the International Fund for Ireland for inviting Unheard Voices to share our experience of helping people to emerge from the conflict in Northern Ireland, what we refer to as the Troubles, and to consider any lessons or implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For a quarter of a century, Craig Enterprises has been to the fore in my community in championing dialogue, inclusion and peace building. Decades of research testify to the fact that Derry is one of the most disadvantaged areas in Northern Ireland, if not the most disadvantaged. The city has very poor health outcomes. It has the second highest unemployment rate in the region. It has the highest youth unemployment, and it has the highest long-term unemployment. These facts lead, in effect, to social exclusion and poverty, and also feed into the conflict, resulting in many awful events, including Bloody Sunday on the 30th of January 1972. Finding ways of combating these issues and dealing with the legacy of the conflict has exercised the minds of many groups, including ours. The International Fund for Ireland has supported Craig Enterprises since 1991, helping us to establish a more inclusive and more peaceful community. Craig Enterprises would argue that if others in local and regional government committed themselves to following the example of IFI, a neutral and risk-taking organisation, in supporting and working in partnership with communities such as Craigan, we would all benefit and see the full potential of our peace-building process. Our experience demonstrates that the job of peace-building is almost always slow, usually challenging, and often dangerous. Nevertheless, we have found that policies which involve marginalisation, demonisation and exclusion do not work. They're counterproductive. Throughout my experience as practitioner in a number of successful projects, I have found that community development and self-help initiatives will always be a core part of any solution for peace building. They are both integral to the rebuilding of local economies emerging from conflict. In 2013, we set up the Unheard Voices project and have always maintained that women are essential to peace building in our community because they play a central role within the home and in our families. Their experience, their empathy, their intelligence, humanity and compassion can ripple out into the wider society, influencing others for the better. Of the 3,500 people who lost their lives in the Troubles, around a tenth were female, but overwhelmingly, the people who deal with the fallout from conflict, who pick up the pieces afterwards, You're left with the challenge of repairing broken families and rebuilding shattered lives of the women. Their efforts have been heroic but largely unacknowledged. This is what the Unheard Voices project sought to address. The Unheard Voices project provides a unique platform for local women whose voices have never been heard. We've engaged about 2,000 women, giving them the space and the opportunity to examine the recent history of which many of them were a part and to share their experiences. Many of the women are now realising that they have much more in common than they first thought. One key strand of Unheard Voices, its oral history programme, led to the publication of the book Beyond the Silence. It's also an ebook, which details the harrowing and intensely personal stories of almost 30 immensely courageous women from very diverse backgrounds. It reveals the diversity of their circumstance, but also the parallels between their stories. Critically for us, each of these Unheard Voices has written the woman into history. The women's testimonies provide us with important insights. They reveal the devastation that the violence of the Troubles caused and the trauma that it left behind. Many of our Unheard Voices are still living with the consequences. In most cases, the women were grateful that someone simply asked to hear their story. Many benefited from speaking to us. They found the sharing cathartic. For many, it was a turning point, helping them to deal with their hurt and pain and to move on with their lives. The focus of the book was quite straightforward, and the invaluable assistance of trusted key women who play important roles, mostly voluntarily, within their own communities, enabled us to identify women who were willing to speak about their experiences. Without the help of these key figures, many interviews could not have taken place. Beyond the Silence, which has now been adopted as university text at Yale, grew out of quiet meetings which we facilitated involving previously voiceless women from all sides of the Northern Irish conflict. By providing a safe, shared space and an informal, non-judgmental forum, for discussion and common activities, we encouraged women to share and then write about their different experiences of the conflict. What emerged was a realisation that loss, grief, pain, exclusion have had a devastating effect of all those affected by the Troubles, regardless of their particular circumstances. By sharing their experiences, the women gained a whole new insight, allowing them to empathise with one another. Bonds developed, leading ultimately to friendship. Quiet diplomacy and discretion has always been the focus of Craigan Enterprises' peacebuilding work. Therefore, it was through such diplomacy that we were able to involve the women and recruiting them to take part in events where they could safely witness the other side's traditions. They developed a trust and a confidence in one another. This then allowed them to explore what had divided them and the circumstances that had caused them pain and grief. It was enlightening to see that all participants, including former paramilitaries, security personnel, and civilians, sharing a human empathy that left them wanting to talk about their own experiences openly and honestly. But they also wanted to understand the experiences undergone by their fellow participants and learn from those who had suffered like they had. Many of these women who had never met before the programme are now lifelong friends. And importantly, they are taking their new learning and sharing it within their own communities and families. I'll single the cases of two of our participants, Marie Newton and Sharon Cross, whose innocent relatives were murdered. Marie and Sharon had never met before engaging on the programme. Today, though, they are as close as mother and daughter. Neither woman has ever received justice for their loved one's murder. But having their story committed to print, having it told, has helped heal some of the wounds. Senator Mitchell's success in brokering the Good Friday Agreement was due, in no small measure, to his skill and experience as a diplomat, but also to his understatedness and trustworthiness. He got great results through quiet diplomacy. Craig Enterprise's Unheard Voices programme also strives to work discreetly and respectfully and to earn the trust of participants. We're never going to match the impact that Senator Mitchell had. That required governmental buy-in and presidential intervention. But we can help create a society in which there is respect and tolerance. There has been much talk of building walls of late. We, in our community, have had far too many of these. They're built to keep people apart when we ought to be bringing people together. It isn't walls we need to build. We need to build bridges. I'd like to finish with a short video of some of the courageous women who took part in Beyond the Silence. Thank you.
Bossing, singing, carrying on, wrestling. House just died. Came down 2 roads tonight. I'm lucky that I got the right road. I confused it with the wrong.
I did what I had to do, and I felt it did make a difference.
I just can't, I suppose, let this go because I think that we deserve justice like everybody else.
And you can't be going to be right till things are resolved and we get answers and truth. All we want is the truth. For years, when John was ready, we didn't talk about it. They couldn't cope and I wasn't able to cope. I was no good to them then, but I'm the happiest person now.
Well, thank you very much. It's not that easy to follow on from that, but I appreciate having the floor, and it's fantastic for me to be here again at the US Institute for Peace, and so thank you very much for hosting us. I'm going to, in my very short time, maybe step back a little bit and raise some sort of slightly broader issues about the role of civil society, the role of funding organizations, the role of community groups in peace processes, and some of the challenges that have emerged from the Northern Ireland context. I'm going to try and do that in 7 minutes. I am originally from South Africa, have been living in Northern Ireland for 15 years, so between my African time and my now Irish time, that's an incredibly difficult challenge for me. In some senses, I'm going to pick up on some of the issues, actually, that Senator Mitchell mentioned, some of the ongoing struggles that happen post the peace process, and some of those issues that are facing the society. Let's see, that works, okay. So I'm going to try and restrict some of my comments to the civil society focus, and I think that Adrian has covered a fair amount of that in terms of some of the work of IFI. So I'm not actually going to repeat much of that. But to really note that a lot of the work that has taken place has been at the levels of socialization, social cohesion, facilitation, and service delivery using Pfaffenholz's 7 functions of civil society. So a lot less focus on issues of monitoring, advocacy. There's been elements of all of that, but much more actually in trying to transform sets of relationships within society and within communities. And as Adrian pointed out, a lot of the earlier work focusing much more on economic issues and then moving towards what one could very broadly call reconciliation. And what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk is outline some of the challenges. And to my mind, a very simple analogy of thinking about it at this point in time, it's a bit like a really difficult stain that you're trying to remove. In some senses, you can remove some of the issues when you do the first clean of it, but then there's the sort of core bit, the really hard bit that Adrian mentioned, the harder pieces that become incredibly difficult to remove. And I think the society where Northern Ireland is at the moment is in that position. And part of that could be, and there have been various reports that have mentioned this, seeing the process to some degree as a negative piece, where a lot of the issues in terms of violence have decreased, in terms of some levels, higher levels of political cooperation, but a lot of the underlying issues around economic development, around social division remain, and this creates some of the tensions within the peace process. What I'm going to do in my brief comments is really build a little bit on some work that a colleague and I, Grania Kelly, did in Northern Ireland. We developed a framework for reconciliation that was used by the peace program in a lot of their funding. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking to you about the framework because we don't have enough time to do that. But essentially, we think of reconciliation as the process of trying to deal with conflicted relationships. And this is difficult because you're often having to not just rebuild relationships, you're actually having to build relationships in the first place. So the notion of reconciliation is slightly misleading because you're not really reconciling. Sometimes you're actually reconciling issues in the first place. And we talk about 5 activities that you generally need to do: developing a shared vision of an interdependent and fair society, acknowledging and dealing with the past, building positive relationships, significant cultural and attitudinal change, and substantial social, economic, and political change. And I won't go through in detail what we mean by each of those, but just to add that for us also, many of those tasks are actually contradictory in peace processes. So for example, acknowledging and dealing with the past, as Senator Mitchell mentioned, you might have to release ex-prisoners. And releasing prisoners for some people is actually going to be an injustice. But at the same time, you're saying we also want to build positive relationships. Those issues are paradoxical. Or if we think of South Africa, we're saying we want to build positive relationships, but we have to change the economic and political structure, which means some people are going to have to lose power whilst rebuilding relationships with people at the same time. These issues are sitting in tension with each other. So I'm not going to go through the model in great detail, but to say that this is a framework that we have used. And I'm going to use it now just to finally give a little bit of a diagnosis of where I think the current process is in the Northern Ireland context. And when Adrian saw this, he said to me, "I'm really interested to see what you actually meant by this picture." And I think what it firstly demonstrates is my complete inability to actually use PowerPoint and to make fancy diagrams. So that's probably the first lesson that you can take from that. But I'm going to try and explain what all those little wiggly lines actually mean. And the first is that at those first 2 levels, developing a common vision, what we mean by a shared vision is not that people have to have the same political aspirations, not that everybody has to agree what the constitutional solution is to the Northern Ireland context, but they have some sense of where they feel they're going, which might be we want a better world for our children, we want an end to violence. And what our sort of diagnosis of the current political context is that actually, although there was a great increase in that sense around the development of the agreement, actually over time, the sense of a common vision has got less and less. Now, some of that might be that the early parts of the agreement, some people have called it a constructive form of ambiguity. It meant that everybody could actually buy into it because they felt it was either protecting the Union or actually moving one closer to a united Ireland. And over time, maybe it's become clear that now exactly what's going to happen is becoming more and more difficult. And so actually that sort of rather strange line of going up and coming down is to say actually this common vision is becoming harder and harder to maintain in the current context. Dealing with the past, in all our research around the issues of reconciliation, it continually comes up as the issue that has still not been dealt with in the peace process in the Northern Ireland context. The hurts of the past, how to deal with issues of truth, justice, reparation, and that still remains an undone piece of the peace process some 20 years ago. So that terrible wiggly line is meant to sort of show it's somewhere still going down and not actually being dealt with. In the other two areas, building positive relationships and significant cultural attitudinal change, what we see there is actually where the significant investment in civil society has actually been. And on those two areas, that's actually where we have seen some of the greatest shifts. But what I should add as a caveat to that is some of those shifts have not been dramatic. So we've been able to track through the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey attitudes in the society over 20 years. And we can safely say that attitudes are improving, but very, very slowly. So when we ask people, how do they feel relationships have improved between communities, it's steadily been going up, but only a percentage or 2 points each year. So there's no sort of dramatic shifts in those attitudinal changes. But that's really where civil society has put most of its energies. The reality of the social and economic picture is that it has improved, and actually that line is probably not good as it's sort of going up because it's sort of gone up and down at different points in time. But increasingly, there is a perception that the new institutions are maybe not delivering what people actually want. So in, I think, 2002, when we asked people, do they feel the Assembly has contributed a lot, I think the statistics were around about 20-25% of people saying that. In 2015, only 10% of people are saying that. So there's a sense that maybe they're not getting that full delivery. Some of that is perception, and some of that is reality. Underneath all of this remains a lack of, social division within the society. 6% of children going to integrated schools, housing and communities still remaining segregated. So these are the underlying issues that still create some of the negative piece. So to conclude within my very short period of time, I wanted to conclude by mentioning, Senator Mitchell, in fact, had also talked a little bit about this. It sort of said you cannot simply build a peace process at the civil society level, and that you need it to take place at all levels. And I wish I had thought of this, but I'm going to use the work of Interpeace, and they've started to talk about what they call track 6. And what they mean by that is not that track 1 is what happens at the political level, and track 2 is what happens at the civil society level, and track 3 happens at the community level. What they mean by track 6 is how does number 1, 2, and 3 add up to 6? And I think that that's really helpful. And they're interested in the connective tissue between levels 1, 2, and 3. And I think that remains the challenge in Northern Ireland, that we've had a significant investment in that track 2 and track 3 level, and Adrian and Carol have outlined some of that. But there still exists a gap between the political reality of the delivery of that and what's actually happening at that community level. So I know that that's perhaps slightly broader, but for our discussion, I maybe just wanted to outline a slightly wider framework for us to be thinking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you for my fellow panelists for making my job so easy by having described so many of these dynamics in such a vital and interesting way. So thank you. And great thanks to the U.S. Institute of Peace, to the Embassy of Ireland, to Lucy for bringing us all together. It is such an honor and privilege to be here because over the last 20 years of my career, I've worked closely in both the Northern Ireland and the Middle East contexts at a civil society level. So I don't have PowerPoints today, but I was asked to give a bit of historical perspective about the civil society experience in these conflicts and to compare some of the trends between Northern Ireland and the Middle East in 7 minutes, which I will try to do. So I could not agree more with Senator Mitchell that both the political aspect and the reconciliation aspect, neither is necessary, or neither is sufficient, both are necessary. I would also agree about the track 6. I never quite heard that formulation. I think it's very good. I almost think about it as an estuary where the fresh water and the salt water come together, where that area is both a place of great growth and nourishment, but can it also be a swamp and a morass? And how do we try to make the best of that interaction between what we might call the track 2 and track 1, track 1.5 public peace processes? So first, let's look at the reconciliation aspect. And some of the most moving times of my life have been sitting in rooms with Israelis and Palestinians, with Protestants and Catholics from Northern Ireland, and to hear how they work themselves out of their own pain to understand the other side. And this is tremendously, tremendously moving, where you can see those dynamics of a peaceful future start to happen. Some of what goes on in those rooms are about acknowledging pain, of being a good listener, to understanding the loss and the trauma that people feel. 20 years ago, we didn't understand the neuroscience of trauma and how we know now that it can actually be epigenetically transferred to the next generation. But we did see were courageous people willing to say, I'm going to share my story, but I want to hear yours so we can imagine a more peaceful future together. There's a lot of time spent interpreting history, and we tend to think about peace processes at the civil society level as moving forward, coming up with creative solutions. But a great deal is also understanding the past and reinventing narratives of peace and justice and who is grieved, and a joint understanding that there are grievances on both sides. Senator Mitchell talked about the role of paramilitaries, prisoners, and the difficulties that they created for these processes. I actually found that the role of ex-combatants could be extremely positive. And whether you're looking at paramilitaries or at militaries or at people who've taken up arms in any way, often the most credible peace builders were those who had fought, who had been imprisoned and had a change of heart, because they were instantly credible within their own societies. And there's a feeling that if someone with blood on their hands could make a conversion and could now be a soldier for peace or a speaker for peace, that had great credibility. So I think we have to understand not only the negatives, but also the positives of bringing people with violence into these conversations. And finally, understanding that the role of civil society in terms of reconciliation doesn't end with the peace agreement, and that in fact, often the times after the peace agreements are the bloodiest times in civil wars. So one thing civil society can do is to think about implementation, that often you have a three-way handoff. Civil society works at track 1 level, you have the peace agreement, and then it's handed off to another set of implementers. But the role of civil society, of women, of academics, of religious leaders, of ordinary citizens to support a process has to be designed so that there's full inclusion within the process. I think Northern Ireland was very special in making sure it included women and some other groups working more at the civil society level, but then making sure they're integral to the implementation. It can give a directness, a sense of momentum, a sense of continuity. I would say one major difference at the civil society level between Northern Ireland and in the Middle East was a sense of a movement. In the Middle East, especially at the earlier days of the crisis 20, 25 years ago, there was a sense that both sides had to gather together to change the environment on the ground through movement building, through very dramatic acts. One example, somewhat more recent, was people who had both lost children in the conflict coming together for a joint blood bank, and then having a public interest kind of documentary coming out of that. The understanding that if you can share blood, if you can be blood donors, that there's something that brings you together across the lines of conflict. So I think that idea of movement building didn't take hold quite as much in Northern Ireland, where we saw a great emphasis on relationships, on reconciliation. But in Northern Ireland, what we saw was more engagement of civil society in institution building, and especially around policing, of how does civil society perceive the police? Are there ways to change the relationship between the police and citizens? to think about power sharing agreements and how that would affect citizens. So I think that Northern Ireland could learn from the Middle East in this movement building, but that the Middle East could learn from Northern Ireland in terms of how to bring citizens into the institutional negotiations. Now, moving on to the political, this is where we get more complicated, because it's integral for civil society to help create a new landscape on the ground where top-down leadership can exert its influence. And so in both cases, we saw widespread dialogue about, well, if it went in this direction, could you accept that? If it went in that direction, would that be a non-starter? Trying to change public perception about the other side. If the other side is not demonized, they become a force that you can negotiate with. So there is a great deal civil society can do to create a new political landscape. There's also a lot that political society can do in engaging with Track 1, both in the Oslo process, but also the Good Friday agreements. There was almost daily contact between civil society leaders and government leaders who are working on the peace agreements. So that kind of escape valve or steam vent, creative idea making, testing ground is very important in that Track 6 estuary kind of landscape. What's dangerous, though, is when you start asking civil society to make political decisions that they are not empowered to make. So it's very tempting, and this happened in the pre-Oslo civil society discussions that I was involved with, where each side says, well, we can accept this as a two-state solution. We can accept this, where you have people making very hypothetical agreements at tremendous personal risk, because they're often then kind of seen as being exposed and vulnerable or having given too much away. So where do we draw the line between giving new ideas, of testing, assenting perhaps, but then actually trying to take the role of policymakers? So I think there needs to be much more exploration on both of those sides. And finally, I'd like to say one thing about the role that academia played in both of these conflicts in terms of some civil society processes. That I personally was involved with efforts at Stanford University to bring participants to California, but also to bring Stanford on the road, both into the Middle East and to Belfast. And the dynamics were fascinating. First, from a legal perspective, when it was still illegal to be dealing with the PLO or with Sinn Féin, we could give the fiction of an academic conference where people could be under one roof together and actually engage. But the second was to see how academics could take frameworks and to try to put the conflict in a context, much as we did earlier today, to say this is what this dynamic looks like. This is how you might get around it in a way that's less threatening because it's academic. But you also had people like Amos Tversky, and if any of you have read the book, The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis, he's completely changed the way we think about how people make decisions in an area of loss and how losses can loom larger than gains. So to have professors talk about how you're receiving concessions, how you think about negotiation in a space of sacred values, there's a way of bringing it to a somewhat more objective level while still dealing with these very deeply held principles and history and pain. So I think it's been a somewhat understudied role of how universities can serve as safe spaces, but I saw it play out in very interesting and engaging ways. So I look forward to the rest of our conversation. Again, I want to thank all of our colleagues here who have thought so deeply and spent so much of their lives working on these two very, very difficult conflicts and giving us real space and sparks for hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and to all the panel. We have a little bit more time than we thought, so I think what we will do is that I will ask a couple of questions here to kick off the discussion, and then we'll move very, very quickly to the audience. So perhaps, Adrian, if I might start with you. I mean, Senator Mitchell in the past has talked about the Palestinians and Israelis not being ready for peace. To what extent do you think the IFI helped prepare the ground in the period between the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement to get parties peace ready, as it were?
I think one of the things we talked about earlier was the need for community engagement to believe that they were developing the solution. Like any other change process, giving ownership to those who are going to be most affected by that change makes it more sustainable and the possibility of actually working. And what the fund had done was to work very closely at grassroots level, as Senator Mitchell talked about, to identify what the emerging needs were for communities and help to address that. And they owned the solution. So they knew it was community-led solutions at a time when what you were trying to do was get them to a point where nearly take peace out of the equation. Say, what is a peaceful society? Well, I think as Melanie said, what is it you want for your family? What's the better outcomes you want for your family, for your children? Is it about education? Is it better employment? What is it that you want? And the fund very much engaged at that level, identifying what the needs of the community were, and nearly took the peace aspect out of the equation. And once you start building that momentum behind change about how life could be different and how life could be better, ultimately it's hard to stop that momentum at a community level. And I think that's where we found ourselves getting to the point where, yes, it needed political leadership around the Good Friday Agreement to make that happen. There was certainly a momentum behind that, and post-1998, the community nearly surpassed the expectations of politicians, of the politics of Northern Ireland, and that's what kept that momentum.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Carol, you spoke at some length about the role of women in civil society. I mean, we've just had an election in Northern Ireland. I mean, two positive aspects, I think, are that 30% of the new assembly is now female and that 3 of the 4 party leaders are women. But nonetheless, in the whole area of civic society and peace building, perhaps women have been underrepresented. Yeah. How would you feel, coming from the perspective you're coming from in Derry on that?
Well, I think, for me personally, whether I agree with politics at Stormont or not, I think it's great to see women rising up and taking a lead role, because at the end of the day, they're mothers, and they've no doubt been affected by the Troubles. The women that I would work with at grassroots ground level or ground at community level, they have been largely unacknowledged for many, many years. And I don't think their roles have been recognised enough. During the worst times, when their loved ones were murdered or their husbands went into prison, and it was the mothers that kept the visits going, maybe up to the prisons, and they just kept life going, kept families going, they kept homes, communities, streets. I mean, women really are the backbone of community. And they're not, they really weren't looking for praise, and they still don't continue to look for praise. But really, just what they really do want is maybe through our project is to receive some recognition of what they've actually gone through, because no one has ever asked them, ever, about the hurt and the pain. They were just expected to get up and get on with life. There's still a lot of psychological trauma that exists with a lot of the women that we work with. And we provide a lot of support for them through the programme. So, I think that's, it's a vital importance as well. I think women just want to be included. And as I said, they really do need to be recognised and their roles valued. Because without women, you're useless.
Thank you, Carl. And maybe that's a good way to segue into Melanie and your own experiences, to build on that in terms of civil society and the broader aspect of increased female participation.
So we found in the work that we did that women were absolutely central in both processes. And they, just as Carol said, that they formed the backbone of their communities. They often were the early warning systems. When they could sense that trouble was happening because they saw their sons or their husbands kind of taking up arms or having meetings, they could have that early warning function. They were able to speak with one another in a kind of common language across boundaries. We also found they did very well, and this is part of, I think, a larger trend in civil society, is that as moderates, because many of them were moderate, we talked to, it's not to say there are no women at the extremes, but the groups we worked with were moderate. They often found more in common with each other across the divide than they did with their own extremes. And they're able to build coalitions across the divisions in a way that then were almost more of a silent majority And so when things started to get difficult, when the extremes started to turn to violence, they had that core and could bring other people in with them. That was very important. But one thing I really am scared about right now in the Middle East is that ability to come together across that line, I mean, for women, for anyone, is vanishing. Because as the societies cannot work together, where the peace efforts are really happening within each community, we're missing the opportunities to have the demonization, the humanization, and actually what women have done so well, we're being cut off now.
Thank you. And Brandon, you talked at length about the prism of reconciliation. I'm sort of challenged. I'm still trying to figure out the graphs and the direction of lines. But what I wanted to be struck by is in an international context, how does that rate of reconciliation compare to similar areas of conflict around the world? I mean, is the experiences you've seen polling over the last 20 years, does that tally with what we've seen in other places, or is it particularly unique to Northern Ireland?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as everybody says, every context is really, really different. We like to use that model as a way of trying to make a very macro analysis of different contexts. So it's not meant to be a micro analysis, more of a sort of macro analysis. So if we think of, say, South Africa and Northern Ireland, needless to say, they're massively different contexts. I was interested that Senator Mitchell said that he thought the Middle Eastern problems were more difficult to deal with than Northern Ireland, and I often think that Northern Ireland is more difficult to deal with than South Africa, because in the South African context, is basically you had two sets of nationalists. They just didn't agree on who belonged in the nation. So once you could get an agreement that everybody belonged in the nation, you could create new symbols, you could create a new nationalist agenda that everybody could buy into, whereas in Northern Ireland you have two people who want to go to two different nations. And so for me, I often think that's a more difficult problem to deal with, and then you essentially have an agreement rather than a settlement. We had a settlement, whereas now you just have an agreement which has sort of postponed the ultimate problem, and so all the challenges I was mentioning there. But if you use that model as a macro form of diagnosis, and you compared Northern Ireland and South Africa, what I would say is on those first two dimensions, building a common vision and dealing with the past, South Africa was much more effective. That sense of the rainbow nation, all that big language, where we might be going, it was actually a lot less effective on the relationship building and changing attitudes. And that was largely because we used a sort of structural mentality, which was that if we changed the structures in the constitution and we got different people into business and into boardrooms, that somehow the relationships would just start to work. So we had no investment in actually building relationships between black and white South Africans in the way that has taken place in Northern Ireland. And then, of course, the biggest weakness in the South African context is that level of equality. You know, the sort of unsolved economic problems. So in a weird way, if you compare the two societies together, if you almost stuck the two reconciliation processes together, you almost got the perfect reconciliation process. You know, if you had certain leaders, not that Northern Ireland hasn't had moments of visionary leadership, it just hasn't had it in a sustained way. And if you had that dealing with the past with the investment at the relationship level and the change to the economic base. You know, so that's how I would often use it. I mean, that's a very broad analysis. But I find it a useful way to sort of think, well, where do we put our energies right now? And if you look at Northern Ireland, the energies clearly need to go into those top two levels.
Okay. I think that's the kind of answer I think that prompts 10 other questions. But we should go to the audience. So if I could ask people to identify who they are, and by all means make a short observation, but do try and keep it brief so we get as many people in as possible. I see a lot of hands, but I'm going to start with Norman Houston from the Northern Ireland Bureau. Sorry, I should say there's moving mics. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Could I ask a question particularly to Carol and Adrian about the issue of division? And you're working in communities that don't generally mix with each other at all, and you're part of the process of trying to break down those barriers. But before those people meet the other person, do you do anything to try and help them before they have that early engagement? How actually do you prepare people for engagement?
Well, I work through a lot of trusted networks, trusted key people in the communities, in particular the Protestant Unionist community. I have strong networks, well established from many years ago. These individual key women who have tried to keep their communities together, and they are able to identify and signpost me personally to women that they feel who could really benefit from engaging on this particular program. When we get there, when I kind of get past that, it's really about building up trust with this particular individuals or a small group of individuals with the key person that I will be working alongside. And that just could be a series of informal meetings, cup of tea, nothing very structured at the beginning. It's very slow and it can be very challenging. The women may not want to turn up, they don't know me. I come from a different background. I work in Craigan, which is a Republican nationalist area, predominantly Catholic. So why would they want to talk to me? So it's really about me trying to build up the trust and earn trust, I suppose. But once we kind of surpass that, I would do the same. There's key women as well. We have key women in the Catholic nationalist areas as well. So I would bring them together through facilitated informal meetings as well. And when you're doing that, you tend to be a bit creative. You end up maybe bringing the Catholic women across the Peace Bridge over into the waterside area. And that is, for a lot of the women, that could be the first time in maybe 10, 15 years that they've ever crossed over. So it doesn't happen overnight. There's been quite a few of those type of those setups that we work towards. Some of the women told me, had said to me, I don't want to know anything about peace, just like what Adrian had said. You know, when you say you're running a peace impact program, a lot of the women do not like to hear the word peace. So they'll kind of maybe shut the door and ask you to kind of come back another time if you've something better going. But I don't kind of give up too easy because I know for a lot of these individuals, and I would have been told this, that these women have suffered hugely, immensely. So I suppose it's really about bringing the women together through different, very creatively, quietly, diplomatically, as I had said. So, and we would maybe embark on what's termed a single identity work, bringing women together from their own community. They look at maybe some history from their own community, and then very slowly, gradually introducing other women from other communities. And then when they get to know each other, they realise that there's a lot of common issues here, and they just tend to, luckily enough, they've tended to click. So, Adrian, you might want to add to that.
Norman, it really depends project to project, or indeed program to program, what it is we're trying to achieve. If you look at the end of the timeline again, where we're talking about the hard issues that we're trying to resolve, we do quite a bit of preparation work, and the way that the fund is set up to work with groups such as Carol's is that we have managing agents on the ground across Northern Ireland, who have a network across Northern Ireland, who would identify groups and have early discussions with groups about the potential of working a project. That conversation could last for 12 months before they even get funding, understanding what their needs are, understanding what the difficulties might be in addressing those issues. And quite recently, over the past 3-4 years, the fund has redesigned looking at single identity activity. And what we mean by that is either working solely with a unionist community or solely with a nationalist Republican community, to the point where they feel it's ready to engage cross-community. And it's not necessarily required at the beginning of the program. Ultimately, you want them to get there. But like any other conflict, what we're trying to achieve with those groups, and a great example, I think, of it is around parading with the Londonderry Bands Forum, which is a project that we funded. And it's about a single identity project, taking a step back in a very safe environment, not having conflict within the project itself. Take a step back and having a look at where the other issue is coming from, where the other side is coming from. Can you understand their thinking with respect to the problem? And working from that starting point. So single identity for us has been crucially important over the past number of years, ensuring that we can set the foundations for those groups to look at themselves, to look at the preconceptions and maybe the misconceptions that they have outside of their own community and address those first before they can start to move forward.
Okay.
And that's been extremely successful for us over the past number of years.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adrian. I think what I might do is I might take 3 questions together, I think, just in the interest of getting as many people in as possible. So I'll start maybe here.
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services. We work on peace building and conflict resolution. For Professor Hamber, the macro question, the media in Northern Ireland, over these decades, what has happened in terms of programs, in terms of encounters, in terms of call-ins, in terms of stories, and how has this impacted lives? Surely there's media research on this and people's perceptions of what the media is doing well or not. So that's the question.
Thank you. And the gentleman here in the center.
Thank you. I'm Paul Smith. I'm a youth worker from Belfast. Part of the AMBIT study visit to the US at the moment that's funded by IFI and organised through the Washington Ireland programme. And one of the focus of our visit is looking at programmes for youth at risk. And one of the sort of legacy issues of the conflict that we're trying to deal with is the ongoing brutalisation of young people by paramilitary organisations. And we're having attacks on individuals within communities 2-3 times a week. A lot of those are shootings where people are shot in the knees or elbows, or beatings where people are beaten with different kinds of cudgels. And it's a practice that was developed during the conflict by the competing paramilitary organisations, but it's carried over, and it's a mechanism that organisations are now using to hold control over those communities. So I'm interested in hearing what the panel think about how we start addressing that issue, and in particular, we need multi-systemic approaches because a lot of the young people themselves are extremely vulnerable even before they suffer one of these attacks. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll take one more question. We'll go back to the panel. Perhaps this gentleman up here on my right.
Thanks, Chris Bauman, National Defense University. Question primarily for Melanie, since you've been in both contexts. In the Irish context, clearly many women's voices have gone unheard. My question number 1, is that even worse in the Israeli-Palestinian context? And if that's true, is that contributing to it being more difficult to resolve?
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll start with the media question and Professor Hamber.
Okay. I feel my colleagues can probably answer that as well as myself. I mean, if I try and answer it in a short way, I think that the media has really struggled to report on the peace. They find it much easier to report on the conflict and past violence, and have struggled to find a new set of language for articulating some of the issues into the present. You know, if I give you an example, this is a number of years ago, I was on a talk show, and there were 2 people on the talk show, 2 former ex-prisoners. And they'd actually been involved in a program that I'd been involved in, a dialogue program, for a number of years. And at some point, the person running the program sort of said to the one guy, well, what do you think of this? And then he turned to the other person and said, well, I presume you think the opposite. And then the guy said, no, I don't. I sort of agree. And then I could actually hear the person speaking to the guy in his ear. You know, he's got the little earpiece in his ear. And you could hear that they didn't really know where to take the discussion, because now they were in agreement rather than being in disagreement. And I think it's a genuine issue. And so, you know, it's hard to engage the media, right? I'm on the board of an organization called Healing Through Remembering, and we did a report looking at the role of the media. And when we finished the report, we invited a whole lot of journalists to come and talk about it and how they might engage in some of these discussions. None of them came. They didn't want to talk about how they might report on these sorts of issues differently, you know. So I think it's that struggle to report the peace when there's a sort of standard mantra that's much easier to go back to in the past. I'm not saying all journalists are like that, but it still is an ongoing issue. In the current crisis, for example, I was up at Stormont recently. You know, there was almost a sense of delight for some of the media that the institutions were collapsing. There was a sense of palpable enjoyment about the fact that they were going to get lots of column inches out of the fact that people were disagreeing. I don't know if I'm being unfair, my Northern Ireland colleagues can chip in, but I think that learning how to report the piece is a really important issue.
If any of the media in Belfast are finding politics that are a bit too dull, they can come over here for a few months. There's plenty to keep them entertained here, I would suggest. Maybe on the punishment meeting, Adrian, do you want to?
Just a point on that, on the media. I think that good news doesn't sell, especially in the Northern Ireland context. And it's certainly a frustration with a lot of the groups that we would fund and support. It's very difficult to get a good news story out there about reconciliation, but the first aspect of bad news, as rightly said, Brandon said, the media will jump on it. And there's a number of journalists who are trying to do a good job of holding people accountable, especially around some of the most divisive issues in Northern Ireland, and try and bring it out into a public debate. But as Carol could probably tell you better than I can, having those debates in a very safe environment can be very problematic. And when it gets out into the media, it's very difficult to control. Having these very public debates within the media, whether it be radio or television, can be very, very hard to control, and ultimately can harm the medium-term reconciliation effort that you're trying to achieve. And it's certainly something I think the media are struggling with in Northern Ireland at this moment in time, about how do you hold people accountable in a public forum, but also ensuring that it's not detrimental to the overall peace project that you're trying to achieve.
Have to learn to manage it. Through my experience, I think it's good to try and manage it as best as possible, because really at the end of the day, when you're working with people who've been so badly affected, it's they're the priority. And as Adrian says, you can't afford to damage them anymore by putting them in front of media, and maybe improper reporting or inappropriate questions being asked. So, as project implementers, I feel very strongly about protecting the women from the media, and using, having the right platform to start showcasing their stories and the project in a positive way. So I suppose in a way, when I talk about managing it, we would be very selective as to we try to be selective about who's going to report and report on the issues. So.
Can I add something to, just because it links to Paul's question?
Sure, yes.
Because, you know a lot of this, Paul. You're more of an expert on it than me in terms of the youth work. But in terms of linking the issue of the assaults of young people by paramilitaries, and I'm trying to pick my words here because my comment I want to make is exactly that. There has to be a reframing of some of these issues, and the media has a role to play in that. So every morning, or not every morning, some mornings you hear this report that there was a 16-year-old injured in a paramilitary-style attack. Now, that is massively problematic. 20 years on from the peace agreement, a young boy is shot in the kneecaps, and you report it as a paramilitary-style attack, which gives it some sense of legitimacy. It has no legitimacy whatsoever. And so there should be a reframing of the language, for me, is one of the first steps, in which we say, a child was assaulted. That's a completely different way of framing that issue. And I think until we find a new set of language for expressing these issues, it's going to be really hard. And I think that there has to be a concerted effort, not just for paramilitaries, but across the societies, whether it's churches, business, communities, academics, how we start to reframe some of the current problems 20 years on from the peace process. The latest Northern Ireland peacebuilding report, paramilitary violence has largely decreased, but paramilitarism has not gone away. And so that has to be, for me, a massive reframing of the language around that, and the media is really critical in doing that.
Melanie, you want to say something about the last question, which I think was to do with the role of women, particularly in the Middle East context?
So I'd like to address that, and very briefly, the violence against young people as well. So I would push back just a little bit on what I think the assumption was, is that somehow the role of women is somehow less important or less visible in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I've seen very powerful women on both sides doing amazing work within each of their communities recently. What we're not seeing, and where women often shine, where they get the media attention, is on the cross-community work, because they can't build the kinds of bridges that Carol talked about. Because that work is so curtailed right now, we're not seeing as much of that. But I would really argue against the fact that there's less engagement by women, at least in this stage of that process. On the youth issues, I would like to highlight the work of one of our members called Cure Violence. And they've been working with gang violence against youth in Chicago, but now expanding throughout the world. And they take an epidemiological approach to violence, that it's contagious, that young people are often the victims, and that there are ways of interrupting it. And it might be a kind of fresh approach that frames it differently from what's happening in the media now.
Thank you very much. I think we have just time for one more round of questions. So I'll take 3 more questions, and I'll ask the panel to be brief so we can squeeze them all in. We're starting with this gentleman here in front, and then this lady in front. And I'll take the back there. So starting here, this gentleman here. Yeah. So, okay, so we have the microphone, yeah. So I will go ahead with this gentleman who has the microphone here, and then I'll move to you, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm Howard Sumka. I was with USAID for a long time. I was the director of the West Bank Gaza mission and director of the Bosnia mission and some other things. To take this back a little bit to the comparison or to the relevance of the experience in Northern Ireland to the experience in Israel-Palestine, it struck me when Senator Mitchell was talking, and he described the Good Friday Agreement as setting a framework within which peace could be pursued nonviolently. And it struck me that Oslo was about the same thing. And the Good Friday Agreement is now 30 years old. Oslo is 23 or 24 years old. It was at a panel here at USIP last week described as a failure. And I wonder if you look at Oslo and the Good Friday Agreement in the same framework, that is to say they set the context for making peace, how would you evaluate them and compare them? And related to that, a sub-question, not a second question, a sub-question. The objective, as I understand in Northern Ireland, and I've never worked there, is that you have 2 religious groups living in a relatively small area, and the objective is to try to integrate these groups into a functioning society. The dominant paradigm in Israel-Palestine is actually quite the opposite. It's to separate into 2 states so that you have the Israelis on one side and the Palestinians on the other, and you avoid the conflict. How does that difference in paradigm, societal integration versus separation, affect how the experience in Northern Ireland informs that in Israel?
Okay, thank you. We'll take this lady here.
Yes, I feel that the Palestinian-Israeli situation is much closer to what's happening in South Africa than to Northern Ireland. The Palestinians are considered second-class citizens. They can't run for office, for prime minister. All those on the West Bank in Gaza can't vote. They have no say. They have no nationality. They have no passport. I find that the situation is very different from Northern Ireland and a lot closer to South Africa.
Thank you. And I think this lady here in the center. Yeah.
Oh, yes, me? Is it on? Yeah. My name is Joyce Schwartz, and I'm with a civil society group in the U.S., New Story Leadership, which brings Israelis and Palestinians together here in the summers. And my question is sort of a macro question. We've talked about the divisions between people and how the media can exacerbate that. But I worry a lot when I look at the world and I see how countries line up on the Israeli-Palestinian question. So you have a place like the US, which is very pro-Israel, lots of countries in Europe, which are very pro-Palestinian, and I wonder how you all think that might be affecting the issues there, that involvement of other countries around the world. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think this lady here for one literally very last question, and I will ask the panel in very brief because we are literally out of time.
Thank you very much. My name is Marina Tianis. I work for EcoPeace, which is an environmental peace-building organization that grew out of Jordan, Palestine, and Israel for the past 23 years. And my question really relates to very much similar, but more on a government perspective and the local leadership. How do you break that capacity for them to feed off each other so that one becomes stronger by demonizing the other, and really start creating also that top-down peace building Because we have a lot of success from the grassroots, but we're having a bit of a challenge with getting Netanyahu into a room and really start seriously negotiating here.
Thank you very much. So that's 4 questions. I'll ask them to be very, very brief. Starting maybe with the Oslo and the Oslo Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement point, maybe Brendan or Melanie, do you want to grab that one?
I don't know if I can answer all of those questions. So to me, it feels like that's a really good segue into the next session. I mean, maybe I'll maybe come at things in a slightly different way, building a little bit also on the South African issue. I mean, I think that one of the things that's often understated well, I'm going to mention 2 things that I think are often understated in peace processes, and I'll leave it up to experts this afternoon to decide if they have any relevance, because I'm not sure if they do. But, the one is how, when you build a negotiation, do you create a sense of dignity, place, respect for people in a peace process? How do you actually do that people who, even if they feel somewhere unequal, have a sense in that negotiation that there is some sense of a level playing field between them? And I think that that's a really underestimated part of peace processes. It's one of the reasons why the current Northern Ireland context is not working, because there's a perception between people that they're no longer respecting each other on certain levels. I think that that's one of the challenges, and it'd be interesting to hear how people reflect on that this afternoon. The other thing, which maybe links a little bit to the last question, is that it sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but I think we underestimate the importance of the relationship building component at the political level. So we can talk a lot of time at the sort of community level, but actually the relationship building at the political level is hugely important. Part of the reason why Northern Ireland worked was because different politicians up to 1998 had been taken to South Africa, to other places, to get to know each other. There was actually an active process. Then we went into this phase of assuming that if they were working in office, things would actually just improve without actually building on those relationships. And what we've had is a fundamental breakdown in trust, because we didn't actually invest in building the relationships between people. So it's a long way around of maybe trying to say that the key to the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement was that people agreed that they would pursue their political aims by peaceful means. And I'm not sure how close or far the Middle Eastern context is from that, and probably quite far. But to get to those 2 places, I think you needed that relationship building, and you needed those very active processes of how people felt that they were somewhere, had a sense of dignity and respect of one another. Otherwise, they weren't actually going to go anywhere. And now, actually, in Northern Ireland, I think we've reached a bit of a fork in the road, where this idea of pursuing by peaceful means, where's that now going to go? In the past, that was the game in and of itself. Now it's like, where's that actually going to go? So that's way beyond, I think, if you think of Oslo and Northern Ireland, I think that's where they've sort of maybe diverged.
Melania?
Well, I fear I don't even want to take on your question, Howard, and hope that will come out in our discussions. I would very much emphasize what you just said, Brandon, about the need for relationship building among political leaders. And I think the best mediators do that. If you read George Mitchell's book, Holbrook's book even, Jan Eliasson's work, Matti Ahtisaari, they talk a lot about the hours they spend in the room helping political leaders discuss many of the same questions that we do at the civil society level. It's just done in that more formal process. But I wonder if I could speak very briefly to your point about the role of the kind of international megaphone. And I think it can be extremely unhelpful, because every constituency within the peace negotiation has a champion that feels it incentivizes bad behavior. And I think some of the more successful agreements have come about because we've been able to quiet those voices, or to have enough voices say, you need to be at the table, and knocking some of those heads together. And I think it's very dangerous to see, even on our college campuses here in the US, how the Israeli-Palestinian debate is happening. And we're not showing the kind of dignity in those discussions that we actually need to be happening at the table.
Just on the second point on the first question, just around about whether integration was required, and I think in the Northern Ireland peace process, it was really the only option was integration of the 2 communities. Yeah, you could separate, but that's avoiding conflict. It's It's not resolving the overall problem. It's not identifying the problem and putting a solution in place around that. And religion in Northern Ireland was not the issue. It was about identity and about territory. Religion just happened to be the demarcation line between the two communities, but it was never about religion. So it was about identifying the way that integration could happen. And that's exactly why the fund looked at various aspects like shared education and shared housing and shared communities, and trying to ensure that there's core integration at a community level to remove the prospect of conflict. For me, I think it was the only solution that we had within the Northern Ireland context to enable that to happen.
Adrian, Carol, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I think just following on from Brandon's point about promoting reconciliation in communities, I really do strongly believe it's the way that projects are delivered. And I think if projects are delivered and with humanity and dignity, you will inevitably get people to engage, women and other participants to engage. And for me, I think that's been, that's a key learning point. I think if you talk directly to them and treat them with respect and really try and understand what they've been through and show a bit of humanity in your work, and I think you'll get results.
Thank you, Carol. Well, it just remains me to say thank you all for coming along today and for taking such an active part in the discussion, and to ask you to join me in thanking our 4 panellists. And now I think as we exit out that way, there is much needed coffee and tea outside. Thank you for this. Good job, Carol.
Thank you.
Let's do it right now.
Someone who was like
Do I just... well, should I? Yeah. Dear guests, greetings. We're about to start the second panel, so I would ask for your attention, please. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody enjoyed the short coffee break and had time to think about our earlier panel discussion. And I would also like to reiterate thank you to our partner, the Embassy of Ireland, for providing timely refreshments. So I hope that now that we're back here, we're feeling energized as we get into our next conversation, which will focus on the on Israeli-Palestinian peacebuilding and try to kind of tie the strands of the previous discussion we had on the IFI in Northern Ireland to what can be done in the Israeli-Palestinian, or what has been done, and looking at the lessons learned in the Israeli-Palestinian case. I'm Rami Dajani. I'm the moderator in this session, and in addition to working with Tony Blair as an advisor on the Middle East politics, I'm currently a senior fellow here at USIP. So I've had a bit of experience myself looking at the issues of peace building, both from the top down and bottom up, and I will be looking forward to asking a couple of questions myself to my panelists here. And I think based on the previous conversation that we listened to earlier today, some of the issues that stand up have to do with fundamentally the issue of the political horizon, or where the politics is going in a particular conflict, and how that impacts ultimately the ability of civil society and other actors to do a real grassroots top-down effort, bottom-up effort in peace building. And in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian case, it goes a level beyond the Northern Irish case, I believe, in the sense that there is very heightened animosity by many people on the Palestinian side, and differently on the Israeli side, to issues that are known as normalization, or having normal relations with one's enemy before there is a peace agreement. And so this is an important issue that I hope will come up in the discussion today on this panel. Secondly, I think there was an interesting discussion earlier on about the difference in peace building between efforts at integration or integrating societies that have suffered through war and conflict, and between separating. And whether, in the case of attempting a political separation requires a different set of tools or efforts as one where you're trying to put together societies that have been internally divided. And I think that's an important distinction that came up in the question and answer, and I would be interested to see how further we can explore that. And finally, the issue of the regional environment. In the Northern Ireland case, we had a very different, as Senator Mitchell, I think, pointed out earlier on today, a very different set of regional players and a regional context than we have in the Middle East today. And I think one of the questions in terms of peace building and developing this thinking in the Israeli-Palestinian case is to ask that question: is how can we, how do we deal with the fact that we have these intrusive issues that come in, that interweave through the conflict, and whether that can be used as a way to actually move forward on peace building rather than seen as a detrimental factor. So with these short comments in mind, I would also like to introduce the panel to you. The first speaker today is Dr. Sarah Yerkes, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution and adjunct professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She served in both the Pentagon and the State Department, most recently as a member of Secretary Kerry's policy planning staff. Previously, she was a foreign affairs officer in the State Department Office of Israel and Palestinian Affairs. And during the 2013 negotiations, she was responsible for outreach to civil society in support of the peace process. Second speaker, or just to my left here, Joel Brownold is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, a contributor to Haaretz, Jerusalem Post. His work has been published in national and international publications, including New York Daily News, The Guardian, Huffington Post, The Hill, and The Daily Beast. Our third speaker is Father Josh Thomas. He's the International Executive Director of Kids for Peace and a member of the ALMAP Board of Directors. He has over 15 years' experience leading interfaith education and peace-building programs for youth in the US, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Jerusalem. During his 7 years as Executive Director, Kids for Peace has grown rapidly to become the largest and most diverse interfaith youth movement in Jerusalem and the first national network of interfaith youth programs in the US. Our final speaker is Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen. She's the Director of Arab-Israeli Conflict Programs at USIP, where she focuses on the role of Israeli and Palestinian civil society in peace-building efforts and the interplay of grassroots and Track 2 efforts with official diplomacy. So we're off to, I think, a second great discussion. I've asked each of the panelists to share their opening comments before we move to more of a conversation and then open the floor to questions to you, our audience. So, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a few words on the relationship between civil society and the political leadership. And I want to point out three challenges. The first is that I see this as a chicken and an egg question. You need civil society to push leaders to the negotiating table. Once involved in negotiations, civil society and the public at large need to make it clear to the political leadership that stepping back or walking away from the table would be more politically risky than staying there. And at the same time, civil society cannot be too far ahead or too disconnected from the political leadership. We've heard many critiques, and these I think are growing in recent days, that the Israelis and the Palestinians are not, quote, ready for peace. So the leadership will not force peace on a public that's not prepared for it. But in my mind, this is really just an excuse on behalf of the political leadership because they themselves are not ready for peace and are not ready to take the risk necessary for it. Furthermore, this line of thinking has a very poisonous impact on the prospects for peace. It both paralyzes civil society and gives government on both sides, on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, an excuse to refrain from real efforts at peace. The second challenge, this comes from my own experience working on these issues in the US government, is that governments tend to be focused on governments. At best, they forget about civil society, or at worst, they intentionally disregard the publics that they are supposed to be working for. So while I agree with the comments that Senator Mitchell and many others have made that civil society is certainly not sufficient for peace, what's clear, and I think we saw this in the case of Northern Ireland, is that grassroots efforts are crucial to sustain a peace process. The third challenge is an information asymmetry between civil society and government. Particularly during negotiations, civil society and the public will necessarily have very little information regarding the substance of the negotiations. We saw this play out in the 2013-2014 negotiations most recently. This makes it extremely difficult for civil society organizations themselves to assist in supporting the peace process. How do you design a campaign around a subject you don't know about with content you don't know about? And how do the negotiators are unable to benefit from a positive public or critiques from the public feedback on the peace process itself, if it's secret. Moving to today, unfortunately, I think we're in the worst of all scenarios. First, there's a tremendous disconnect between pro-peace civil society groups and their political leadership in both the Israeli and the Palestinian context. On the Israeli side, Prime Minister Netanyahu's far-right government has enacted a series of laws and is continuing to enact a series of laws that discredit left-wing civil society groups and discourage international support. This is both rhetorical support as well as financial support for civil society. On the Palestinian side, the anti-normalization campaign continues to discourage Palestinian groups from engaging in cross-border activity and in pro-peace activity in general. I'll note that we did see Abbas meet with Rabbi Rick Jacobs just last week, I believe, who represents the largest denomination of American Jewry, which is a good sign. Maybe there is some movement on the Palestinian side, but Abbas is hardly seen as credible by all Palestinians, and there is a big difference between Abbas meeting with an American Jewish group and an Israeli Jewish group, which he was able to do just a few years ago. The second reason I'm worried is that where we are today is that pro-peace groups are weaker and they're losing momentum. While some groups are growing, particularly among younger generations, and I'm sure Josh will speak about the work his group is doing, first-generation groups and their political backers have been steadily declining in influence. In addition to the Israeli government's attempts to limit their influence that I've mentioned, funding is also under threat in the United States. Just last week, Senator Lindsey Graham reintroduced the Taylor Force Act, which would threaten to cut off all U.S. assistance to the Palestinian Authority. And the Trump administration's desire to cut a third of the State Department budget is not a good sign for this sort of work. Now, neither of these directly impact civil society work, and hopefully they would leave civil society efforts alone. I hope Joel will give us good news. But at the same time, I think we should not be under the illusion that any funding in this climate today is safe. So I think, and we'll get into this more in our discussion, but an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace might actually be both more necessary than ever to fill in the gap left by dwindling funding sources, but also more difficult than ever to achieve. The third reason for worry is that the status quo is not only sustainable, but has contributed to a growing physical and psychological divide between Israelis and Palestinians. When I was at the State Department trying to create a civil society engagement strategy long before the negotiations, our mantra was improving the quality and quantity of contact between Israelis and Palestinians. In the absence of negotiations, we felt that in order to prevent either a low-level recycle of violence or an outright war, and to create the conditions on the ground for peace in the long term, it was essential to encourage interaction between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as amongst Israelis and Palestinians of differing ethnic, political, and religious backgrounds. And if you haven't seen the monologue by Israeli TV commentator Asaf Harel, I encourage you to do so, because he makes this point much better than I will. But the basic point is that it's much easier to hate someone that you've never met. And this current situation that we're in is not only allowing, but encouraging Israelis and Palestinians to completely separate from each other, which is a recipe for continued conflict of cycle of violence and not peace. So this has been very depressing, I'm sure, but let me end with just a few lessons I think that I learned today from the Northern Ireland conflict that I think apply very directly from our experiences that we've had in our own conflict that we deal with. So first, a fund or any sort of other civil society effort needs to be a true bottom-up endeavor. It will lack credibility and impact if it is seen as driven by governments, not by the people. The second is the importance of self-help or economic-driven programs. We see this in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict very clearly, that people are more likely to cooperate if they're getting some sort of tangible benefit for themselves, an economic benefit, skills, access to services, cleaning up a shared space, these sorts of programs. So in a sense, you need to remove peace from both the language and from the motivation for the program. Third, this is a long-term or generational challenge. Civil society has a role to play before a peace process. It has a clear role to play during the peace process and long after an agreement is reached. And should we ever get there, and I hope we do, civil society will continue to play an essential role. And then finally, we need to engage both believers and potential spoilers. Melanie made this point about credibility, that in your engagement in civil society programming, we need to think about those that are not necessarily naturally seen as peacemakers, people who are natural spoilers, who are skeptics of the peace process, as well as those who are on our side. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. My name is Joel Branold. I run the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is a coalition of 110 different groups working on the ground, building relationships between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. Firstly, a big thank you to Lucy, USIP, the Embassy of Ireland, also Senator Kane's staff, who actually did the original shidduch, the original match between myself and the Embassy of Ireland that I think kick-started this event. And it's interesting that they did that. And the reason being, the Alliance for Middle East Peace since 2009 has been fascinated by the International Fund for Ireland. We're just mystified that there was this collaborative funding that came together at scale that before a peace process and then throughout, after the Good Friday Agreement, created scalable funding for civil society and gave it a necessary role. You know, with all the things that Senator Mitchell said that it's not sufficient, it definitely had a place at the table. And the reason we were excited and why we wanted to do something like this where we learned the lessons is when we look at our conflict and when we look at civil society today, what we lack is possibility. So what do I mean by that? It's a misnomer that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been showered with resources. And even if we look back to the Oslo days itself, peace and reconciliation was an afterthought. In the original Oslo Accords, peace and reconciliation did not actually feature. It was until the second Oslo Accords, after 95 and Prime Minister Rabin had been killed, that it first featured. Funding did not start from the EU until 1998. And the US program at its current scale of $10 million a year didn't start till 2004, the second Intifada. So if we compare that to Northern Ireland, where funding began in 1986, and we look at our conflict, we actually had to wait for the US to kick in till after we had had the second Intifada before we started looking at seriously trying to put some money into peace and reconciliation programming. Now, if we actually look at the current funding today, we see two, I would say, pretty big obstacles that prevent us moving forward. One is bureaucratic and one is legitimacy. On the bureaucracy, civil society has been segmented away from economic development and humanitarian assistance. If you look at the humanitarian assistance that keeps Gaza alive, you know, even if it's just barely, and other things, this is coordinated by the Norwegians, is very much a humanitarian assistance program. If we look at the economic development, whether it's from the Office of the Quartet Representative or other things, again, this is separate funding that is from things that are linked towards trying to do peace and reconciliation. And that creates a problem. If you completely separate it, there is no linkage between, as I think Adrian said in the first panel, the infrastructure of peace and community groups who are trying to actually show that there is a community effort behind this. And the separation and segmentation prevents complementary reinforcing dynamics. In addition, and something that I find fascinating, when I speak to various governments around the world who do want to get involved in civil society, with the exception of the US actually, they always tell me, whereas peace building is OECD compliant about how they spend their development money, they can't spend any money to benefit an Israeli because Israel is an OECD country. So even if they wanted to, they can't utilize their dollars to also do civil society work that could benefit Israelis. And therefore, the even funding structures prevent from the governments themselves from doing things that they know is necessary. When you add both of those bureaucratic challenges in, it actually leads to a legitimacy challenge. So Sarah pointed on this, and I think Rami in his introduction, you know, international financing of NGOs is a political football today in the region. In Israel, sort of the funding of the European Union, definitely Arab state funding and others, is seen as incredibly controversial, as something trying to undermine democracy. And on the flip side, by the way, US funding is not exactly the most prominently supported work for Palestinian NGOs to take, though it's not as seen as critical as the other way. So when you add in the bureaucratic problems with the legitimacy problems, what you get, as one former senior member of the State Department in Secretary Kerry's team told me, was no bandwidth and no budget. So even if Secretary Kerry's team had wanted to include civil society, there was neither the bandwidth or the budget in order to do that in an effective mechanism. We lacked what the International Fund for Ireland had, an independent group that woke up every day and thought about how do we try and bring these populations into a position where there is a political context that can make this work. So what is it that we're looking for as we try and learn the lessons of the IFI in our context? We're looking for complementary, flexible, legitimate funding. So let me break that down. Complementary. What that means is it doesn't need to just say that civil society works completely siloed from economic development. If, for example, we're trying to re-energize Gaza with the Marine One terminal, and because of the politics that has to go through Ashdod, then let's actually have a conversation in civil society, both in Gaza and in Israel, about why that's in the interest of both populations. Let's link the human capital work that exists into the wider economic space. And let's think about that complementary, so when we think about peace infrastructure, it's locked in. Flexible. It's not only about scaling NGOs. So yes, NGOs have been starved of resources, and what they've done on a local level could easily be scaled if we moved from sort of seed money to Series A. But it's also about, what about if, let's look at the communities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Sderot that border Gaza. So let's assume, so we're doing economic development in Gaza, but these communities are actually suffering under rocket fire. The legitimacy that would be seen in Israeli society of international financing also helped defend hospitals and schools and kindergartens that are spending vast amounts of philanthropic resources just to defend them would be massively increased. If we look at, I'm sure Josh will talk about the after-school programs in East Jerusalem, where there is no shared space to put 500 families, but we could use this as capital project money to actually build shared spaces, something that the International Fund for Ireland did. Legitimate. As I already said, funding is sort of a political football, but the aim of the International Fund is to mirror what the International Fund for Ireland did. The reason that the US was essential is because it was trusted by Catholics. And the reason that the Commonwealth was essential in the funders is it was trusted by Protestants. When we look at our conflict, the Israelis trust Congress. They do. And they also, to some extent, trust the Canadians. The Palestinians trust Europe and trust the Arab states. And the concept that we're trying to do is replicate the legitimacy and the newfound potential Gulf-Israeli alignment on some things to create a funding vehicle that can advance these potential things that will actually have a benefit and show legitimacy on the ground that can also help overcome the other issues. So where are we up to on this? It's not just sort of a pipe dream. ORMEP's been working on this for a while, and we've made some interesting progress. I think the first thing to say is we've tried, and I think successfully, to make sure that as the international community examines what it's doing on this conflict, peace and reconciliation is no longer an afterthought. If you look at the quartet document that was produced on July 3rd, the 10th and final recommendation of that document, after much lobbying, actually recognized the need for the parties to take seriously the need to encourage peace and reconciliation and anti-incitement work in each of their societies. We also found out in sort of the expose of the Kerry talks that there was a culture of peace text that the parties actually spoke about in these negotiations. In addition to sort of the diplomatic work, we've been working legislatively, both here in Capitol Hill, in the UK Parliament, in Canada and elsewhere, getting legislators to put forward legislation to actually create an international fund. Given the uniqueness of the US congressional system on appropriations, we spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill. And actually 2 weeks ago, Congressman Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican appropriator, and Congressman Joe Crowley introduced a bill to authorize and create an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace. They were mirrored by representatives in London from the Conservative and Labour Party, actually introduced a private members bill, and we've been working with a few other governments, with the French initiative and others, to advance this agenda. Just to finish my remarks, something that Senator Mitchell said and has become a mantra of mine since I started this job. We don't believe that we are sufficient to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But too many people see us as nice, or as afterthought, or as sort of the cutesy stuff. But if the commanders for Israel's security sort it out, that will help. If we just look at economic development, that will be our solution. If we can just put the leaders in a room long enough, that's going to work. We are a necessary part of this problem. We're not sufficient, but if we are only seen as nice and not necessary, we will again repeat the same mistakes. And as a new administration attempts to make the ultimate deal, we have to remember, we have to create the foundations correct if we're going to create the long-term attitudinal change that Professor Humber shown, that it's going up 2% each year, instead of at the moment that we have in our conflict, the most skeptical people in our conflict today are the youth, who make up the majority of the populations. And so if we need to reverse that trend, we need to do long-term strategic funding. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you. It's great to be here and talk a little bit about Kids for Peace, to put some flesh on the bones of what we've been thinking and talking about, and to respond especially to what Joel just mentioned about reversing the trends among the youth. I want to give a glimpse of what we are up to and where we have been over the last 15 years, what we have learned, and what the fund would mean for us. Speaking of cute, we do have some cute faces. This is advancing a little faster than I thought. We do have some cute faces here. These are the first 12 kids who started Kids for Peace back in 2002. Traveled to a summer camp in Houston, Texas, based on dialogue and understanding, cross-cultural sharing. They're all now 25, 26, not quite as cute anymore, but still very committed to this work. And Kids for Peace began as a way to bring together the religious dimension of Jerusalem. To feel that religious stakeholders were not having a part of the process in the peace movement at the time, and that this city, which is a uniquely complex final status issue, which is chock full of religious dimensions, needed a religious solution. So we have been bringing together Jewish, Christian, Muslim youth and their families from widely different backgrounds across East and West Jerusalem and neighboring areas of the West Bank for the last 15 years. And here is where we have come to today, starting from those first 12 kids. Today, Kids for Peace is a movement of 500 families across East and West in Jerusalem. This is just one grade level of our 6th graders from last year gathering together for one of their after-school meetings. So if you take this picture and multiply it by 6, that's Kids for Peace today. We really are working not only on issues of dialogue and reconciliation and mutual understanding, but also to support the pro-peace voices within each society, to help them feel strong, empowered, a sense of a future, a way that they can be involved in creating this different reality, and to take those pro-peace forces on all the different sides of the conflict, among Israelis, among Palestinian citizens of Israel, among Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, among Palestinian residents of the West Bank, connect them all with each other so that they can see there is a partner, a real live human partner on the other side, and to develop long-term, deep, meaningful, mature, complex relationships that eventually unfold in political advocacy and social action. One of the key strategies for us is to have everything be jointly led. This is one of our great pictures. It's Meredith Rothbard, an Orthodox Jew, Riham Subhi, a traditionally Palestinian Muslim, who are the two main directors of Kids for Peace today. They lead a team of 10 full-time staff, 50 educators and facilitators who come from all parts of the city, who hold this community together and guide people through a process of growth and learning over the course of the long term. Kids for Peace today is a global interfaith youth movement. The kids join us when they're cute little 12-year-olds like that first slide, and they stay for 6 years of year-round activities, twice a month after school, twice a year leadership seminars, a summer program each year, moving deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into understanding not only each other's perspectives, but also each other's daily lives and realities. A big new part of Kids for Peace, funded by a grant from USAID, is bringing the youth into each other's neighborhoods, physically crossing the lines where they don't normally go, stepping literally in each other's footsteps, and seeing what it's like to grow up in East Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, just in those neighborhoods of Jerusalem near to the wall. And so this is what Kids for Peace has grown to be and become today. When people think of interfaith and youth programs, you often think of a crazy picture like this, with a bunch of kids smiling and laughing and making peace signs on the floor. And this still very much is a part of who we are and what we do. And building a sense of hope and possibility in the face of so much despair, cynicism, negativity remains one of our biggest contributions, and one of the things that draws families into Kids for Peace who are looking for a better life for their children. Parents really are our customer. They're the ones choosing to bring their kids into a place to meet the other, have a chance to have a safe, nonviolent after-school alternative, especially for East Jerusalem Palestinians who don't have very many choices, especially not very many choices that are free, and to be able to be in an environment where they can grow, develop some skills, and have a nonviolent avenue to be able to change their reality. That's the positive side of the story. The challenge that we have found over the course of the year are two. One is a resilience, and the other is action. How do peace communities keep their faith, keep their hope alive in the most difficult and challenging moments, in escalations of violence, in times when political agreements are breaking down? And one of the most critical moments for us happened in the summer of 2014 during the fighting in Gaza. It was Ramadan. We did not have very many youth programs. We figure having youth programs while people are fasting is probably not a great plan. So we had been dormant for a while. People hadn't seen each other, and we had had a Ramadan iftar scheduled for a very long time. There was a big question about whether to move forward or whether to cancel. It was a day when rockets were falling. It was a day when soldiers were being killed in Gaza, and our staff on the ground was really unsure what to do. Would anybody come? Would this be the moment when the Kids for Peace community totally unraveled? Would this be the moment when they discovered they didn't really have a partner on the other side? But we decided to move forward anyway and see what would happen. And that night, 65 families came together for the Ramadan iftar, including those people sitting there on the room, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And in that moment, the confidence of the community went way up and said, you know what? We do have a partner. You're going to take a risk to be here the same way as I'm taking a risk to be here. And from that, the confidence began to grow. The next stage they started asking was, so what about our relationships and our dialogue and our conversations with one another? How is that changing the reality around us? So they began taking the first steps to move into the public sphere with this great little protest at Mamilla Mall in Jerusalem, where the staff were out in front and the kids following along, standing up and bringing a public voice. And developing that public voice of peace building, connecting the dots between interpersonal transformation and social transformation has been the work of the last phase of Kids for Peace. Now our youth are following in the footsteps of the adults who went before them. This is a group of our teenagers at a Tag Meir event standing up against racism across Jerusalem. And at the beginning, speaking to the anti-normalization that we talked about before, many of the young people were worried what would happen if they were seen in public together for peace. They're regularly called traitors and spies and betrayers of their people, face massive negative peer pressure from their schools and communities. But what we find is that each time they stand up and do a public event like this, they feel more and more empowered, more and more confident, more and more willing to take another step further in the process of peace. And now things that we used to just do with our 11th and 12th graders, our 6th and 7th graders are doing as well, because they see this sense of possibility. Much of this learning around resilience and social action was made possible by a grant from the U.S. Institute of Peace, for which we're deeply grateful. And I think we have seen in Kids for Peace in the last few years the possibilities of what can happen through really strategic, thoughtful granting. We had a research practice grant that invited us to look deeply at the sources of resilience in Kids for Peace and the reasons why the transition from dialogue to social action was proving challenging and what we could do about it. One of the programs we recently added was a SOMER Global Advocacy Institute, where we train our oldest teens in skills for social change. And here they are here in DC last summer doing advocacy for the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. And Mutaz, who's sitting in the big chair, is a Palestinian Muslim from the Mount of Olives. And he talks a lot about the struggle of being in a conflicted neighborhood where fighting for control of the streets by streets is very much alive. And I asked Mutaz one day, what would it take for you to feel confident and strong in your work as a young person trying to go a nonviolent path for peace? And he said one thing: more people. More people. Being surrounded by a large movement at scale is something that gives him deep confidence. On that same trip, we went to USAID, had a chance to talk to Dave Hardin, who said he still is very famous in Kids for Peace for leading his big talk to us with Taylor Swift's Shake It Off. You've got to shake off the haters and just keep going. But he said to us in this meeting, it's nice to see 40 of you gathered around the table. That's wonderful. Next time, bring 40,000. And it really lit the imagination of our young people to say, what would it mean to have 40,000 people working for peace in Jerusalem? What would it mean if we were part of a community that large and that strong? And so now with the second grant from USAID, we're continuing to build a visible, strong, influential constituency for peace in Jerusalem, and also trying to model some of the practices we hope the International Fund will enhance in the future. This is a glimpse of an event that we had this winter with 400 of our family members gathered together to feel that strength and power. We're also working really hard to be collaborative and find synergies between our work and other organizations so that we're not duplicating efforts. Here you see the YMCA Youth Choir, founded by a Seeds of Peace member. Here in the next slide are two youth from the Parent Circle, the bereaved families group, telling their story, connecting the dots between all of these different efforts and seeing themselves as part of one movement. Lastly, this step into the public is starting to take more and more shape. This is an event that we did this fall where 100 of our young people did a walking tour around the old city of Jerusalem, out in public, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders, stepping into each other's shoes, but also being visible on the streets on behalf of peace. And again, each time that we find the young people are doing this visible public work, their confidence grows. Two last things, and then we'll turn to Lucy. The visibility is a big piece of this puzzle. What we're finding in Kids for Peace is that the interpersonal dimensions, the life of the community, even sustained over many years, needs an outlet. It needs some directionality in order for those interpersonal human relationships to matter. Why am I doing dialogue with one another? What's the political horizon that it leads to? And for us, an intermediary step are these acts of public advocacy, of making their voices heard. There is so much possibility, and I see many of my colleague NGO directors in this room, each of whom could tell hundreds and hundreds of stories of positive, inspiring things that their young people are doing, trying to lead the way to peace. And it really is a lack of resources that's standing in the way. We're ready this spring to open up a hub in East Jerusalem to bring together activists from both sides under one co-working space to streamline administrative services and add efficiencies to the system. We're ready to open a pod of Kids for Peace in the Old City to scale the numbers even more. So the barrier really is funding and resources to create institutions and organizations with enough bandwidth to pull off the 40,000 challenge that Dave gave to us so powerfully last year.
So thank you. I mean, the good thing is my esteemed colleagues and friends here on the panel have left very little to say, which is good because we're at half an hour of time and we do want to get to discussion up here and questions. I do want to, while I want to cut through the thank yous, I would be remiss in not thanking Joel particularly, who is here having just become a first-time father a week ago. Yeah. So. So we're particularly grateful that you're here, and we're particularly grateful to your family, your wife, and your new baby that you're here as well. Really, a lot has been said, so I'm going to try and hone in on a few points. So the one broad point I'd like to make is something that's really a point that Josh ended on, which is there is hope, there is possibility. And I think that does get lost, and often, and Joel touched on this a little bit, often the argument I've heard when we talk about grassroots peace building in civil society is, my goodness, haven't they been at this for 20 plus years in the Israeli-Palestinian context? Haven't there been summer camps? Haven't there been groups? It obviously hasn't done anything. You often hear that kind of very affirmative statement. And you know, the fact is, and as you begin to hear just from Josh's example of just one group existing in this space, and granted an incredibly self-reflective, thoughtful, and successful one, but large networks have been created, and networks of people that have gone on to create other organizations and facilitate further activities. And this is something I think another friend and colleague is in the audience here, Ned Lazarus, has paid a lot of attention to, is when you try to look at the impact of these organizations, often what is not captured is what is happening with the alumna and the graduates of these programs, and what they are going on to do in this broader space of peace building and peacemaking. And that is something that has not necessarily been rigorously tracked. But what it forces us to do, I think, and this is an uncomfortable place I know for funders and implementers to often find themselves in, when you're trying to look at monitoring and evaluation and capturing impact. None of us really know how to wrestle with the proving a negative, right? The counterfactual of what this space would look like if you had not had this the pool of funding you'd had and the energy and activity in this space. And again, this is something that is hard to capture for people in the M&E field. And you sometimes do get the gift, I think, of some concrete examples. Sometimes that gift comes because, unfortunately, you have parallel situations of violence to look at. I'm going to give, actually, one example I'd like to talk about, which was another organization that was a grantee of ours that was working on policing in a divided society in the what's called the shared society space, Jewish-Arab relations within Israel. And I think Melanie was mentioning police-society relations before in the Northern Ireland context. There is some work that's been done on that. The Abraham Fund Initiative is an organization, a former grantee of USIP. And they were working on building trust, basically, between predominantly Jewish police forces policing in predominantly Arab towns in Israel. And you had challenges of over-policing, under-policing, a lot of the challenges that you would imagine. And this was a combination, the program was a combination of police training. It was also dialogue and bridge building between community leaders and the police. Now, again, when I say sometimes you have the unfortunate ability to look at, to try to prove that negative, some of you who are familiar with this space will recall that in 2000, at a particularly fraught time in Israel, it's a sort of second intifada time, and tensions were high, particularly in Arab towns in Israel, and in the course of demonstrations that were happening, I believe it was 13 Arab citizens were killed at the hands of their own Israeli police force. This resulted in a government commission and a lot of inquiry and soul searching, a really low point in Jewish-Arab relations in the country. You cut to 2014, another low point in dynamics, and possibly some would say, again, that sort of the closest parallel was where relations were at in 2000. You had the kidnapping and what turned out to be the murder of 3 Jewish teens in the West Bank, and then a subsequent, what was framed as a revenge killing of a young Arab youth in Jerusalem, and there were demonstrations again. And one of the things that you saw during this time, again, it's not that everything went perfectly smoothly or without violence, but one of the things that grew out of those who've gone through this program, there were those in the communities and in the police who said, you know what, our ability this time to prevent some of what we saw in 2000 did grow out of some of the relationships that were built, our ability to communicate across demonstration lines, and our ability to reach out to those people that we've been building relationships through this program. So that's the kind of thing where you get a snapshot of sometimes you can start to see what can happen and what the possibilities are if you're able to scale up some of these programs, and to try to imagine what this space would look like if you didn't have some of this work going on. You know, Josh, one of the things I was going to reflect on is there is a study, a couple of studies we've been working on at USIP, evaluating peace-building programs. One of those is looking at our own body of grants that we've given across a number of conflicts, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was one case study. The report on that is forthcoming, but I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to reflect on some of the lessons that seem to come out of that study that suggest some best practices for funders and for implementers. But it's funny listening to Josh, because I hear you talk about your work. You're hitting a lot of those factors that influence success. A lot of those are self-reflection, aligning your model with intended impact. That sounds like an obvious one, but a lot of groups, what is it you're trying to achieve with your program, right? What is the exact goal, and are you recruiting accordingly? One of the things that Sarah mentioned was this idea of inclusivity in peace building. That's often been missing in this space. There was a lot of play has been given to the idea that religious communities in particular felt very left out of what seemed to have been largely a secular and sort of leftist process. And the ability, and this came up a lot in the first panel as well, this idea, if you want to build a network and a public environment that will be able to push its leadership towards a peace agreement and sustain it after it's happened, you need broader buy-in than what you often see. So your organization has to have credibility with the right participants. It has to be reaching out broadly. And one of the things, again, that Josh hit on that we see where you see success is when you're moving from, for those groups working just on dialogue, moving from dialogue to action and to advocacy necessary. Now, all of this relates, of course, to what funding is in place. As Joel said, this isn't just about resources, but the ability to scale up with funding and a coordinating mechanism. I think a number of us here were marveling at one of the comments on the first panel that was describing how there was a coordinating mechanism that will sometimes work with organizations for, was it 12 months? We heard to sort of program this right and design the programming right and make the funding. Something that I think all of us in this space say, wow. if you think of the possibilities of what that could actually look like. Because a lot of what I have seen when I look at organizations doing great work is a challenge of sustainability. The way that funding tends to, when I say trickle out now, I mean, there's certainly funding going, but it's often done with a call that requires organizations to plan their projects on a call-by-call basis. There's a call that goes out that says we're looking to fund an organization working on reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, and we're particularly interested in religious communities. So an organization, because it needs to rely on funding to stay afloat, will write a proposal accordingly with the best of intention doing work, but that's not a sustainable model, especially if there's no guarantee that the funding is not going to be forthcoming. One of the other best practices we see coming out of these studies is the ability for funders and implementers to build on previous successes. It's not enough to have one project that is successful and then say, well, great, now let's try and take this to another funder and hopefully there'll be a funding stream available in 3 years. It's a real challenge for the implementers and, of course, the participants in these programs who are then left with some of the cynicism or just the despair, as Josh talked about. One of the important things for youth particularly is feeling that there's a community around them that is building rather than they're going to be left out at sea alone. The one last thing I'll end on with 25 minutes left to go, there's the building on successes I've talked about and being able to sustain investment in organizations that have been working in their space and know what they're doing. And that does happen to some extent. But one of the findings that seem to come out, again, as we're still going through the results of these studies, that I found the most compelling is that evidence-based, as a funder, funding based on evidence is obviously key, but don't do it at the expense of experimentation. One of the things our researchers looked at when they looked at some of our former grantees is that some of the projects that ended up being the most successful when you take a longitudinal view, which we had the luxury of being able to do at this point, is those that started where a funder took a chance. Took a chance at something that seemed a little quirky, a little experimental. They hadn't been in the space a long time. And that's what grew into something that became a self-reflective organization that built upon its successes. So it's about being willing, having a diversified portfolio of funding, being willing to fund high-risk, innovative projects. That's something that has a very important place in this space. And so the idea, I think, is very compelling when I think of what Josh is talking about with this fund. There is something to think about what the possibility that comes with larger combined funding that is also willing to play a role of just not funding cherry-picking projects here and there, but in the process being able to bring organizations together to network with each other the way, again, Josh is describing they're already trying to do. And the ability to scale that up is going to be vital for all the reasons that have already been articulated up here and in the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I think given that we have limited time, I'm just going to make a very quick remark maybe to wrap up and then open the floor for questions. I think as a final kind of note from my end here, having listened to these interesting presentations, is looking back to the sort of the how necessary is the political component? How necessary is there to have, and what is that political horizon? What's the sort of minimum that you need in order to be able to carry out these kinds of activities and to build these kinds of this kind of fund? And interestingly, looking back on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and how this issue was addressed in past negotiations, and I just want to make this kind of quick anecdote in the sense that in, let's say, the Annapolis negotiations, there actually were committees that discussed culture of peace, as it was called, and they had probably one of the few negotiating exercises that yielded an agreed text. So you actually have an agreement on this culture of peace, and you actually have one of the draft articles that both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians, call for the creation of a coexistence fund, and actually refer to in the brackets, refer to Northern Ireland. They actually went on a trip to Northern Ireland to look into it back in 2008, and you actually had one of the most sort of, and the end of this anecdote is, none of the politicians really cared about what this committee did. It wasn't really something that people, took note of because it wasn't Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, etc. But I think the lesson from that is, I think a couple of things. One is that you can actually get far on this stuff very far in the right political context. If people see that things are moving towards what they identify as their major political objectives, a lot of this stuff can happen and much faster than we think. And that's why I'm also a bit optimistic about how quickly things can change under the right political context. So I kind of mentioned, is it absolutely necessary? In the absence of any kind of political progress or diplomatic process, is this still something we should be doing?
Can I respond to that? Yeah, so I think one of the things that was sort of uplifting, but also in the end depressing during the last negotiations was exactly that point, that when you have a positive horizon, there is more room. And we had civil society organizations knocking at our door constantly saying, how can we help? And some of them may be sitting up here, but on the one hand, there was a lot more interest among all of the U.S. government as well as other governments to do something, and recognizing that civil society is there, they can help us, they can be on the ground, speaking for this. But at the same time, there was literally not a dollar dedicated to this effort. And so, one of the things I did was compile all these requests and all the proposals to say, okay, once we get the funding, this is what we're going to do. But we never got the funding because we never got an agreement. And so I think one of the things that we need to think through is, how do you kind of get that funding or make it there, recognizing that just because there's not negotiations doesn't mean there's not a need for this same sort of work to happen.
And I think it's this chicken and egg dynamic that you so aptly framed, right? The idea that, yes, the necessary and sufficient, and it applies to both sides. Neither is sufficient. They are both necessary and need to work in coordination with each other. And it's going to be very hard for publics to push their leaders towards taking these risks if they don't have the investment.
I'll just add in, it's interesting because if you ask Israelis on the ground what the biggest problem is, they'll talk about incitement, which is fundamentally a culture of peace issue, right? And the parties bat around this concept of the trilateral commission to say that they can all point at each other saying, you incited me here, now the Americans have to play referee and hit you on the head and hit you on the head. The point being, it is a recognized issue that the next generation is being lost. It is recognized by the populations themselves, and in the honest moments, Israelis will tell you there is also an issue in Israel, that if you stay under a situation of conflict for long enough, your populations bubble up with racial tensions. And the Palestinians in an honest moment will tell you, yes, it's very difficult to condemn martyrdom, because if someone has martyred themselves in a terrorist attack, it's very difficult for us to then go and criticize the families after that fact when they've given them their lives up for the homeland. And so there is a stark recognition of this, but yet at the same time, incitement has become a political football. And so again, we have to wait until there's the political will to agree where there is no will, while the situation continues to deteriorate. And once again, just drawing it back to the first panel, it wasn't easy for supporters of Ireland in Congress to stand up, I'm sure, in 1985 and 1986 and saying, yes, we're going to do something that honestly felt like working with the enemy at that point, or for members of the Commonwealth. And if there is this agreed culture of peace text, even if the parties themselves can't right now stand up and say, we agree. If, for example, there was an international actor who was trying to get to an ultimate peace deal between the Israelis and Palestinians and felt that their legislators felt that incitement was a really problematic, if they potentially could release text that they knew the parties actually agreed with, and that founded a new Anglo-Irish agreement that something like this could be based on, I think you could start actually draining the swamp that exists in that part of the world, even if it's a start, and something that we should really look towards.
And I think you have implementing partners who are ready to do that. I mean, I hear about incitement all the time. There's tons of organizations working to create the opposite of incitement, recognition of the legitimacy of the other side, the homeland of both peoples. All of these things are there, ready to go. So if you care about incitement, let's do something about incitement. If you care about equality for Palestinians in our community, it's a lot about equality. In Jerusalem, how do we get municipal services to be equal between East and West? If we could make progress on that issue and see that grassroots, nonviolent, joint activism made a difference in people's lives, that then gives you momentum to take it to the next level. It's building this momentum, getting past the starting line, I think, is the challenge.
Can I just add one more thing on that to connect the civil society and the policy piece and try to wrestle with this chicken and egg situation? One of my favorite polls to cite in this, and it's sort of been replicated in many other studies, but when you look at the dynamics that Sarah pointed out into the challenges with anti-normalization and the legislation in Israel, what that's doing to put a damper on civil society, which is what's going to be needed to overcome the deep mutual distrust. There was a poll that was done by University of Maryland. It was Stephen Cullen, Shibli Telhami in the 2014, with which it's not my favorite poll because USIP partnered on it, but we happened to partner on it at the time. But one of the findings, he went through the different components. They went through the different components of a package deal, a political deal, and it polled Israelis and Palestinians, trying, seeing who would sign on to what component, and then the whole package. And the bottom line, to me, the sort of punchiest headline or the biggest takeaway from this poll was that for those who would not sign on to the poll, when they were polled again and said, okay, the other side has signed on to it, now what do you think? Those numbers went up on both sides. So the idea being that public opinion, is dynamic and can be shifted, and so much of that shift comes with belief that the other side is operating in good faith and that success is possible. And so if you think about all the levels of coordination that have to happen there in order to put that in place, but what that means is civil society work has a huge role to play, because that's where this trust building happens, and what happens when you see crowds of people out in the street arguing for something better, arguing for a shared vision, as we heard about in the first panel. So just another.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think given the short amount of time left, we'll take questions. And I think maybe we'll take 3 questions at a time for the panel to address. The gentleman over there.
My name is Willie McCarter. I was the chairman of the International Fund for Ireland from 1993 to 2005. I'd just like to comment on the political comments that have been made, and particularly the ones that Senator Mitchell made. There's no doubt that the International Fund for Ireland did work mainly at grassroots level with communities, with the private sector and so on. But there are 3 separate things that might be of interest to in an Israeli-Palestinian fund. And these are that with the way that the International Fund was organized, where it was owned by both governments but was an independent, strictly independent organization, for the various programs that the fund had, it drew, for the people to work those programs, it drew on the public service from Northern Ireland and the public service in the Republic of Ireland. So you had a situation where in all of the fund's programs, you had public servants who were working together, getting to know one another, getting to know what the programs were. And when you consider the amount of programs that the fund had, tremendous number of public servants working together was one of the features of the fund that helped the whole process along. The second thing was that certainly when I became chairman, I had an average of 3 announcements per week, public announcements where, say, at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the day, there was a public meeting in a local town, village, or whatever. And always at those public announcements, you'd invite local politicians from the council. If you could get members of parliament or members of the Dáil in the Republic, they were invited too. Now, those events, although it was to announce the fund's funding for a particular program, they allowed come and go between politicians who normally didn't have a space for come and go between them. And you could very, very frequently see Sinn Féin and the Ulster Unionists or whoever talking backwards and forwards at these events. So although it was an informal thing, never much written down, and when you consider the number of events that the fund actually funded, say, I was there for 12 and a half years at an average of 3 public events at least per week, you can work out how much space there was for politicians to interact with one another. The third thing was that every 2 months we had a fund board meeting, and I was partly responsible for having a dinner the night before and then the fund meeting the next day. Well, when you consider that the people at that dinner the night before were people from, well, apart from fund board members, there were fund observers, and there were people from both governments. So you had the likes of the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, the head of Anglo-Irish Division in Dublin at that, together with, for example, the Director General of the European Commission, somebody from the American side who had a direct line into the White House, another person from the American side, a direct line to various supporters on Capitol Hill. You can see that every 2 months there was a meeting during which informal discussion took place at a very high level. So I just wanted to point out to you that that sort of political dimension of the fund was there. We felt it was extremely important on top of the grassroots things, and I just thought you might be interested. One final point, I don't know how interesting this might be, but quite a while ago, 1994, 5, 6, and 7, the fund was mandated in the agreement, international agreement that where it was set up. The fund was mandated to set up at least 2 venture capital companies, one in Northern Ireland, one in the border counties of the Republic, to demonstrate the effect of venture capital in creating jobs and so on. Some friends of the fund in Boston who had direct links into the Israeli venture capital startup situation, direct links into the situation in Northern Ireland and the Republic and in the Boston area, organized very interesting meetings on an annual basis where Israelis and people from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland came, met their American counterparts. Very productive thing, quite unheard of in the literature, I think. Someday somebody will write the encyclopedia for the fund, but just thought you might like to know this.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for providing really such a comprehensive portrait, both a macro view and also from Josh, really a view from the ground up of what that work is day to day in Jerusalem. One comment and then one question. The comment is just I want to emphasize something that Lucy was saying, which I think isn't well enough known, which is that this work has been going on for several decades in the most difficult conditions you could imagine, in the breakdown of the peace process and all that's followed, and that there is an evidence base. Many of the groups have been operating. Kids for Peace is now for 15 years, Seeds of Peace is for nearly 25 years. They are still working. They're actually doing very well under the circumstances, and just objectively, they are part of more than 170 groups that operate in that space. And there's an extensive record. There are alumni who are now in their 20s and 30s who are very active advocates of peace, who have gone in exactly the opposite direction as the rest of their generation. They are the people who are now standing up as adults in many different professions and advocating for this. So I think it's very important to emphasize that. There's a lack of visibility and also a lack of knowledge that there are models that exist that really have proven successful over time and in very difficult circumstances. So want to recommend that. There's research I'm glad to share with anyone in the audience. And I'd also like to ask the audience, I think visibility is one of the other issues that's missing. There are a lot of people in Israel and Palestine who would support this work and don't even know that it's happening. And I hear that a lot. I've met youth who said, I would love to meet someone from the other side. Is there a way to do that? They've never heard of any of the organizations that we're talking about. So there's a great deal, and all of us with Facebook, with social media, can do a lot to support that. The question, what do you think the effect of the new administration in the United States will be on the prospects for this work?
Should I just...
One more question.
Okay.
There.
Hi, my name is Obata from One Voice Movement. So one of the questions is a follow-up question and the comment that was made. So considering the context of segregation between Palestinians and Israelis, how do you think we can manage to break that lack of shared spaces and all that? The second thing, sometimes when we think of people-to-people work, we kind of operate based on the fact that the conflict is the center of life. Recently, I was shocked to hear that, for example, one of the researchers points that the conflict is number 8 on the Israeli priority list. So that feels like a prerequisite. How can we tackle this? Thank you.
I'll take the political one to get these guys off the hook. Surprisingly, I'm actually confident, and I'll tell you why. It's still early days. Until May comes around, I don't think we know what's going to happen. But for an administration that's reorganizing America's role in the world, a consistent from the campaign to transition till today has been the desire of President Trump to get a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians. He's sending his top political advisors. Jason Greenblatt's out there right now. And even though there are a lack of political appointees, creates an ambassador, has made it very clear his son-in-law is involved, who is his closest advisor. They've got professionals who they've kept on from the Obama administration in various roles, in those roles. And I think that, you know, as people, it's a steep learning curve, but one that they'll go on. And look, if the desire is to show that you don't have to be a professional in this space to achieve something, let's go for it. The one thing that all the study shows is that hope is essential. And how do you get to hope in an intractable conflict? You create mutability, change. I wasn't confident about a change in administrative approach between Obama administration and potential Clinton administration. I think a lot of the same people would have been around. I think there would have been a difference of degree, but not like a massive shake the snow globe and put it back down. With President Trump, I don't think anyone knows. But what I do know is he starts off with more political capital in Israel than the Obama administration ever had, by accident or design. That's the reality right now. Israelis are worried about upsetting him and think that he's in their corner. We never had that with the Obama administration. With the Palestinians, the expectations are so low that anything's great. And so I think that given that reality, it's actually room for possibility. And we shouldn't discount that. It's counterintuitive and everything else and deeply unfair to the Obama administration and Secretary Kerry's incredibly hardworking team and Senator Mitchell's team. The reality is the Trump administration has a golden opportunity to get something done. And I think it is impingent on all of us to ensure that they are as successful as possible by being as supportive in things that we think will be correct and being openly advising when we think that things are not going in the correct direction.
One point on Ned's other point, which is that this has been ongoing for decades, which is very important. And I've said so many negative things, I want to say a positive thing, which is that one of the high points actually of my time in government was when Josh came in during the Gaza war and talked about the iftar that they had. And I will say, being in the trenches in government and not thinking there was no hope, to hear the story that these kids met, they came out during the most dark time, and that actually buoyed me. And so I think, it's important that there's visibility, that we tell these stories, and that we recognize that even in the darkest of times, we can't give up, we need to keep pushing forward.
And to Obada's point, to the question of what can you do about lack of this not being a priority, I think what we're trying to do, and I know others as well, are trying to find where's my sphere of influence and how can I amplify the voice. So one of the things we're doing with our kids now is training them to speak about their experience within their own schools. So we've had 5 kids this year speak at religious Jewish schools in Jerusalem about their experience meeting Palestinians. Some of them even brought their Palestinian friend into the school for the first time ever. So it puts the conflict on the agenda for someone who may otherwise be able to live in a world without it. I don't know that I have a systematic answer to your question, but I do think just thinking about it and saying, okay, how can I expand the voice? How can I touch more people? How can I make sure that the thousands of people who are part of NGO programs, that the impact doesn't just end with them, but there is a clear process and a systematic strategy and an infrastructure to help them make sure that it ripples to the community around them, not just that you hope it might, because it usually doesn't, but with the infrastructure, I think it does. does.
Because I think if I can just add on to that, the safety in numbers component, which you spoke to, is huge. And I think a lot of people are looking, they need more people around them to put themselves out there in this space. I'd also add, this is something that didn't come up, but there is a value, I think, to the internal work. Somebody mentioned, I think was it Melanie before, on the first panel, talked about how because of anti-normalization and these other dynamics as well in Israeli society, a lot of this work has turned inward. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I'd like to see them both existing together. But those internal conversations within society, intra-Palestinian conversations, intra-Israeli conversations are vital. It's part of that inclusive processes component. And I would like to see, frankly, if we're looking at a fund-type model and scaled-up investment, I would like to see that investment hit those type of programs as well, because that's where those deep, meaningful conversations have to happen that get people ready to engage with the other side and across their own polarized lines.
I think, just because I think we're at the last minute, I just want to add one last thing that we at ORMEP have been working on really deeply, and huge credit to my regional director, Huda Abu Akub, who's really led this conversation around anti-normalization amongst a lot of Palestinian NGOs. I think for many, and I do a lot of talking around the United States and pro-Palestinian groups and pro-Israeli groups and people who are pro, and there's always this discomfort, right? It's a very asymmetric conflict. Now for the Israelis, the asymmetry, they think the whole world's against them and the Arab region's against them, and they feel small. For pretty much everyone outside, the Americans and Israelis, the asymmetry works the other way. I think there's a debate going on there, and the majority of the world agrees the asymmetry runs the way that the Palestinians are the weaker party. The one thing that is not asymmetric but is equivalent is mistrust, fear, and bad intention of each population. And you can be credible about recognizing the asymmetry of occupation and campaigning while also recognizing that peace and reconciliation is necessary because each population equally fears the other, regardless if you believe that they should or shouldn't. I think that it's something that ORMEP has really tried to grapple with about how we can be credible for a very diverse group of NGOs who work within Israel and work cross-border. I think that where we're settling is really on that point, and that all of you, if you want to advocate wherever you personally feel or sit on this conflict, should feel confidence that there is an equivalency in fear, and it exists. It's not in people's just minds, it just does. I think that I don't know a better way of dealing with it than dealing with these programs. And I just think it's an important point to end on because when we leave this room, all the politics flow straight back in. I think it's something that's an important sort of like finishing point on that.
Thank you, and I think with that, we'll conclude.